The story of early monasticism is usually told through the voices of well-known Greek and Latin writers. Their works shaped a powerful and enduring narrative. Monks as heroic figures who abandoned the world, withdrew into the Egyptian desert, and achieved a level of holiness never reached again. Through these accounts, the desert appears empty, hostile, and utterly cut off from ordinary life, a place that only the first generation of ascetics could survive. The image of monks forming a spiritual city in the wilderness became so influential that it defined how later generations imagined the origins of monastic life. This dramatic picture also created discomfort. The extreme discipline and harsh practices described in early stories led some modern thinkers to ask where such radical behavior came from. These practices did not seem to grow naturally from earlier Mediterranean traditions. Instead, they reflected a deeper anxiety of the late antique world, a powerful sense of guilt, and a desire to escape the physical body. Over time, what once looked like madness was reinterpreted as a form of sacred authority. Charismatic holy figures gained influence precisely because of their visible rejection of ordinary life, and scholars began to explore what truly motivated people to adopt this demanding way of living. Yet the desert itself deserves closer attention. Rather than being only a physical location, it functioned as a symbolic landscape. In literature, it became a space of transformation, spiritual struggle, and hope. Whether this literary desert accurately reflected real conditions mattered less than the meaning it carried. The stories focused on miracles, extremes, and exceptional holiness, while quieter and more balanced forms of ascetic life were often overlooked. When these texts are read more fully, it becomes clear that most teachings emphasized restraint, wisdom, and moderation rather than exaggerated displays of spiritual perfection. The idea of the desert as the natural home of monks helped authors create a sharp divide between holy ascetics and the sinful world of towns and cities. But when documentary evidence and archaeological remains are examined, this division becomes difficult to sustain. Monastic communities were far more connected to society than the literary image suggests. They formed a diverse and complex network of settlements, including groups with differing beliefs, all participating in the religious landscape of Egypt. These communities did not exist in isolation from political and religious pressures. Before the Arab conquest, monks lived under close supervision from imperial authorities and were affected by deep theological conflicts within Christianity. After the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, Christian communities were allowed to continue their religious life under a protected status. Monasteries survived for centuries with relatively limited interference, though restrictions appeared from time to time. This balance changed in later centuries. Increasing financial burdens and growing social tensions placed Christian communities under greater strain. During this period, pressure intensified, conversions increased, and the fragile position of monasteries became clear. The history of Egyptian monasticism, therefore, is not a simple story of heroic withdrawal into an empty desert. It is a long and complex narrative shaped by society, politics, belief, and survival. The history of monastic life in Egypt cannot be reduced to a single turning point or a simple change of rulers. It did not end with new administrations or with the arrival of Islamic rule. Instead, it continued to evolve, shaped by local traditions, daily practice, and the lived experience of monks themselves. To understand this complexity, we must look beyond famous narratives and focus on the evidence that reflects how monastic life actually functioned across different regions of Egypt. When we turn to sources written in the Egyptian language, we begin to hear voices that are largely absent from the dominant stories. These texts reveal how monks understood their own spiritual goals and how they practiced ascetic life in communities that rarely appear in well-known accounts. One such voice offers a grounded and practical vision of monasticism, describing not heroic extremes, but disciplined routines rooted in everyday spaces. These writings show that monastic life was not defined only by isolation or dramatic withdrawal, but by sustained spiritual effort carried out in ordinary surroundings. A central feature of this way of life was the monk's cell. Far from being a simple shelter, it was understood as the heart of spiritual practice. Life within the cell shaped the inner life of the monk, forming discipline, patience, and attentiveness to God. Remaining in the cell was not about physical confinement alone, but about cultivating an inner stability that endured beyond its walls. While communal gatherings played an important role, these sources suggest that the quiet, repetitive rhythm of life in the cell stood at the very center of early Egyptian monastic spirituality. The cell was described as both a place of testing and instruction. It was where temptation was confronted, weakness exposed, and perseverance learned. It was also a place of healing, humility, and spiritual struggle. Ascetic practice within this space was marked by simplicity and endurance rather than excess. Food was limited, possessions few, and comfort deliberately avoided. Yet even here, the emphasis was not on harshness for its own sake, but on forming trust, discipline, and inner strength. Other Egyptian voices from the following generation deepen this picture. From Upper Egypt, we encounter a monastic community that developed a highly organized and disciplined form of communal life. This community followed shared rules, common labor, and collective responsibility. Leadership focused on obedience, moral conduct, and the spiritual health of both men and women under its care. These writings present a distinctly Egyptian expression of monastic life, one that balanced strict regulation with practical concern for the needs of the community. These communities were not isolated from the world around them. They interacted closely with nearby towns and villages and could respond to moments of crisis. At times, they provided refuge and support to large numbers of people fleeing violence. This ability to care for others shows that monasteries had already become major social institutions, capable of organizing food, shelter, and protection on a large scale. Daily life within the monastery was carefully regulated. Rules governed interaction between male and female communities, labor responsibilities, and the distribution of food. While boundaries were firmly maintained, cooperation between communities was expected when necessity demanded it. Dietary practices were especially detailed, with different rules applied during fasting seasons and allowances made for the young, the elderly, and the weak. These regulations reveal both discipline and flexibility, showing that asceticism was adapted to human limits rather than imposed blindly. Food storage and consumption were closely monitored, and inspections ensured compliance with communal standards. Even so, the sources acknowledge that rules were sometimes broken. These moments of failure remind us that monks struggled with the same human weaknesses they sought to overcome. Monastic life was not idealized perfection, but a continuous effort to live according to demanding ideals. Later accounts emphasize holiness and miraculous encounters, presenting monastic leaders as figures of extraordinary spiritual power. Yet, alongside these dramatic portrayals, we also find practical descriptions of work and organization. Monks engaged in a wide range of crafts, producing clothing, tools, books, and everyday goods. All labor was carefully accounted for, and personal ownership was strictly limited. Everything produced belonged to the community and was managed through appointed overseers. What makes this evidence especially valuable is that the physical remains of these communities still survive. Unlike many early monastic settlements that have disappeared, this site allows us to connect written descriptions with actual buildings and spaces. Through this combination of texts and material remains, we gain one of the clearest and most detailed views of early monastic life anywhere in the Mediterranean world. Egypt holds a special place in the history of the ancient world because it preserved records that disappeared elsewhere across the Mediterranean. Thanks to this survival, we gain a far richer picture of society during late antiquity and the early Byzantine period. At the same time, these documents mostly reflect urban life, the concerns of educated people, and the voices of those involved in economic exchange. Much of society still remains silent. Yet alongside this dominant record, another kind of evidence emerges from 4th century Egypt, offering a different perspective on early monastic life. These sources do not speak in grand narratives. Instead, they appear in fragments, contracts, requests for help, short prayers, notes scratched onto walls, inventories of goods, and simple lists of names. Though incomplete, they provide rare insight into how monks actually lived and interacted with the world around them. When set beside idealized stories of heroic holiness, these materials allow us to test myth against reality and to see monastic life as it was practiced rather than imagined. Documents from the 4th century confirm that monastic communities already existed at an early date. Many of these records are economic in nature and concern land, housing, or financial obligations. They also reveal that there was no single, fixed term used to describe ascetic individuals. Different words appear side by side, suggesting that monastic identity was still fluid. This variety raises an important question. How could individuals who claimed to renounce material life still appear in documents involving property and financial dealings? Narrative traditions often describe monks as owning nothing at all, sometimes even removing the smallest object from their living space. Yet other stories quietly acknowledge monks who traveled, distributed goods, or possessed items valued by others. The documentary evidence confirms this tension. Renunciation did not always mean total withdrawal from economic life. Instead, it often meant redefining how one engaged with it. A small group of 4th century letters sheds light on this reality. They reveal a monk who acted as an intermediary in legal and social matters, helping others avoid military obligations or secure release through financial means. The tone of these letters suggests impatience, trust, and reliance on his influence. At the same time, other letters ask simply for remembrance and prayer. These requests are brief, emotional, and deeply personal. They speak of trouble, hope, and faith in the power of prayer rather than theological debate. Together, these letters show that monks could be deeply involved in worldly concerns while still being regarded as spiritual figures. Compassion and advocacy appear alongside solitude and renunciation. This challenges the idea that early ascetics lived entirely removed from society. The documentary record therefore reshapes our understanding of monastic life. While literary traditions emphasize extreme isolation and spiritual heroism, everyday documents reveal frequent contact between monks and laypeople. They show shared concerns, mutual dependence, and ongoing communication. Even when some voices urged total silence and withdrawal, others clearly felt compelled to remain engaged with their communities. Another essential source for understanding early monasticism lies in archaeology. For a long time, this field was neglected in Egypt. Many early excavations prioritized ancient monuments and removed later Christian remains without documentation. As a result, much evidence for monastic reuse of older structures and settlement patterns was lost. This has limited our ability to reconstruct how monasteries fit into the broader landscape of towns, temples, and villages. Despite this loss, recent archaeological work along the Nile Valley has begun to transform our understanding. These projects show how monastic communities were formed, where they settled, and how their lives changed under Islamic rule. The physical remains reveal that monks chose a wide range of environments, some built in remote desert areas near trade routes. Others settled along cliffs close to villages, or reused abandoned spaces. In many cases, ancient tombs and temples were adapted for monastic use. One of the most important monastic landscapes developed in a vast desert region known for its clusters of small dwellings. This area expanded over many kilometers and contained hundreds of individual structures grouped into distinct zones. Excavation revealed that monks often lived surprisingly close to one another. Solitude, therefore, did not always mean physical distance. In some cases, neighbors lived only a few steps apart. Early dwellings followed a common pattern. Each included an enclosed space with several rooms, a courtyard, and areas for cooking and storage. Larger rooms likely belonged to senior monks, while smaller ones were used by disciples or assistants. Spaces for prayer were carefully designed, sometimes even shaped to enhance sound. Over time, new buildings were added, and individual dwellings were linked together, forming small compounds that balanced privacy with community. These settlements did not rely on massive defensive walls. Instead, modest enclosures offered protection while allowing movement and interaction. Inside, monks shared wells, sanitation areas, and guest rooms. The layout reflects a life that combined withdrawal with hospitality and cooperation. Another major monastic center developed in a desert valley that remains active to this day. Over time, solitary dwellings gave rise to multiple organized communities. Although written sources provide only fragments of this transformation, archaeological exploration has helped clarify how the landscape evolved. Excavations have uncovered enclosed compounds, churches, living quarters, and clusters of smaller dwellings similar to those found elsewhere. Taken together, these discoveries force us to reconsider long-held assumptions. Early Egyptian monasticism was not defined solely by isolation, silence, or heroic withdrawal. It was a lived experience shaped by economic reality, social responsibility, architectural space, and constant negotiation between solitude and engagement. Through documents and ruins alike, a more human and complex picture of monastic life finally comes into view. When we look at the ground plans of early monastic housing, a clear pattern begins to appear. One well-studied dwelling shows a compact core of rooms that survived in unusually good condition, with later extensions spreading outward in several directions. The oldest section remained standing higher than the rest, partly because newer walls were built right up against it in later centuries and ended up shielding it from damage. Just east of the original living quarters, An open courtyard served as the heartbeat of daily life. A well stood nearby, cooking fires burned in the open air, and broken pottery accumulated where everyday vessels were discarded. Nothing suggests this space was covered, which makes sense if smoke and heat from cooking needed to escape. From that courtyard, additional rooms were added in a later stage. A small area set aside for prayer appears in the northern extension, along with other supporting rooms that would have held tools, supplies, or simple living needs. Inside the prayer space, the monk would face east. The walls were once covered with painted images, and fragments recovered from the debris show that sacred figures were part of the visual world of prayer. What we see here is not a romantic fantasy of a lone hermit in an empty wilderness, but an organized living space that grew and adapted over time. This matters because more than one major monastic region shows the same pattern. In both the northern desert settlements and the valley communities, the remains point to long-term survival and even growth after the Islamic armies entered Egypt. Rather than vanishing quickly, Egyptian monastic life endured, expanded, and reorganized itself across centuries. Far from being a brief, early burst of holiness that faded away, it became a durable tradition that continued through major political change. If we move south, the evidence becomes even more striking. In the Theban region, monks did not simply build new structures, they reused what already existed. Abandoned tombs, older sacred precincts, and neglected buildings were reshaped into places of prayer and work. On one bank of the river, churches appeared in and around monumental temple spaces. On the other, monks settled heavily in the landscape, choosing locations that balanced solitude with access to water, paths, and nearby communities. One settlement from this region shows how practical these communities could be. A legal document describing the boundaries of the site speaks of caves and towers, which hints at a landscape shaped for both seclusion and stability. This was not a vast city of monks, but a small cluster with a focused economy. Linen and leather work played a major role, including the production of burial textiles. Tools and installations found at the site point to a community skilled in craft and organized in leadership. The presence of a formal transfer of authority reveals something important. Monasteries could be treated like property, and leaders used legal procedures to protect what they had built. In other places, we find similar records that show monks could buy, sell, rent, divide, or repair monastic spaces much like any other property. Even individual cells could change hands inside a larger monastic complex. Another remarkable community developed on the edge of fertile farmland near the Fayum. Here, more than 90 residences were carved directly into the hills. Unlike smaller communities that might hold only a few dozen people, this settlement could reach well over 100 at its peak. Excavations over the past decades have revealed a scattered layout, with dwellings spread across the hills. Some lay far apart, others almost touched. The community was loosely connected rather than tightly packed, and the landscape itself shaped how monks lived. One hermitage provides a vivid example. Entry was controlled through a single doorway leading into a central courtyard. Walls and plastering protected the interior from view, shielding the occupants from movement along nearby paths. These monks were not completely cut off. Documents and finds suggest they traded handmade goods such as baskets, and were known for practical services, including medical help for local people. Visitors came and went, and residents took part in organizing supplies not only for themselves, but for others in the wider community. The picture is again more complex than the stereotype of total isolation. The architecture reflects that complexity. Most dwellings spread outward across the slope, with multiple rooms built on a single level. The terrain made higher floors risky, so expansion happened horizontally. Interiors were functional and often plain. Some sites show rich painted decoration and heavy use of graffiti, but here the walls were typically whitewashed, sometimes touched with simple red paint, and largely quiet. Still, familiar elements appear again and again. A prayer corner, a sleeping space, a work area, a simple kitchen, and sometimes a small room for an assistant. This settlement followed its own path, shaped by local conditions rather than copying the more famous northern deserts. A different kind of evidence comes from a major monastery near Sohag. For a long time, it was mainly known inside Egypt, yet it became one of the most influential monastic centers in the region. Leadership and rulemaking shaped generations of monks, and the wider monastic network included both male and female communities, with different styles of life existing side by side. This was not a sealed world. The monastery interacted with surrounding towns and villages and was woven into local society. Archaeological work at the site has revealed substantial buildings that point to strength, resources, and continuity. One residence from around the 7th century stands out as a large multi-level structure built with high-quality masonry beside a broad, open courtyard. Finds from inside the building include large coin hoards and everyday ceramics that suggest long use across multiple centuries. There is no clear sign of a catastrophic destruction layer that would match a sudden collapse at the moment of conquest. Instead, the material record suggests continuity. Other installations indicate a fully functioning complex: food preparation areas, washing spaces, milling, and a planned system for moving water across the site, supported by major storage and deep wells. Pottery scattered across the ground shows occupation lasting from late antiquity into the later 9th century. What repeatedly disappears in simplified histories is how long Egyptian monasticism continued after it became a major force in Western Christianity. The ruins show that monastic life did not simply survive under Islamic rule, it often expanded. The 7th and 8th centuries, in particular, reveal growth rather than decline. At one major desert settlement, later phases introduced new religious buildings and large halls that earlier generations did not use. The scale and design suggest that these monks were now receiving visitors, not only fellow ascetics. Walls were marked with inscriptions that point to pilgrimage and travel, and special sacred spaces began to appear that had not been central in the earliest period. The site was becoming a spiritual destination, and its architecture changed to match its new role. We see similar developments in the desert valley communities. New rooms were added around courtyards, including kitchens, sanitation areas, and large halls designed for gatherings. Painted wall fragments from these expanded spaces include religious scenes and portraits of monastic figures. The pottery record stretches across many centuries, and the presence of large storage containers from the late Byzantine and early Islamic periods shows that these buildings were lived in for a long time. Over time, inscriptions begin to appear in later dialects, and eventually in Arabic as well, showing cultural shifts without necessarily indicating disappearance. In some places, Arabic praises to God appear in church decoration, and the site remains active for centuries before eventual abandonment much later. Further south, along the Nile, a large monastic town reveals the same theme of longevity. It was not alone, but part of a dense regional network of monasteries that surrounded it. This site has long been considered one of the signature examples of Egyptian monastic culture, largely because of the richness of its material remains. Early excavations recovered impressive paintings, inscriptions, and sculpted architectural pieces. Even though only a portion of the settlement was explored, the surviving remains speak of daily life with a vividness rarely matched by written sources. The evidence from this site points most strongly to its peak in the 7th and 8th centuries, continuing into later periods as well. The latest dates and inscriptions show activity well beyond the era of the famous early Desert Fathers. What the archaeology suggests is not a short-lived golden age that ended early, but a resilient monastic world that continued to build, adapt, and flourish under new political realities. With new excavations planned and modern methods now available, we can expect an even fuller picture in the years ahead, one that may reshape how we tell this story altogether. When we ask what monastic life looked like in the Carolingian world, we quickly realize it was never a simple choice between isolation and society. The ideal was to build a protected inner space where monks could pursue spiritual perfection, yet still exist close enough to ordinary people that their presence could teach, inspire, and shape the wider Christian community. In this vision, the monastery was not a sealed fortress cut off from the world. It was a carefully managed meeting point where two worlds touched each other and were expected to strengthen one another. The Carolingian rulers and church leaders wanted monks to be visible. They wanted lay people to see the habit, to hear disciplined speech and ordered chant, and to feel that a higher standard of life existed nearby. At the same time, monks were still expected to live as ascetics. They were meant to model self-control and purity, not blend into the everyday world. The result was a fragile balancing act. Holiness was not treated as something won once and kept forever. It had to be maintained, guarded, and negotiated as monks moved between the demands of community life and the pull of secular society. Some could hold both sides together. Others drifted toward one side and let the other go. To understand this tension in human terms, we can focus on one 9th-century monk whose monastic identity is often underplayed when people discuss his learning and writing. He lived in Auxerre and became known as a talented teacher and author during a period often described as a cultural revival. Yet what made his work possible was not simply education or ambition. It was the daily structure and spiritual center of his monastery. Everything he produced grew out of that environment and returned to it. We know unusually detailed facts about his life because he left personal notes inside a manuscript that also tracked the calendar of the Christian year. From these notes, a clear outline emerges. He was born in the early 9th century, entered monastic life as a child, and was raised entirely within the monastery. By the standards of his age, this was the model monk. Formed from childhood, shaped by discipline, trained for service, and gradually promoted through clerical ranks. His home institution remained the anchor of his identity, and the events he recorded repeatedly circle back to that place. His monastery was not isolated from politics. It stood close to royal power and was pulled into the turbulence of the age. Relics were moved with royal involvement. Royal sons were appointed to positions of authority over the monastery, and the struggles within the dynasty echoed through the community's life. Even when the monks' daily rhythm focused on prayer and study, the outside world pressed in through patronage, appointments, and conflict. At the same time, His notes reveal that his life extended beyond Auxerre. They point to sustained ties with another major city and its religious institutions. We can see him tracking important events there, recording appointments, and showing familiarity with its monastic environment. For several years, he seems to have been away from his home monastery before being ordered back, after which he took on teaching responsibilities. The timeline is not perfectly neat, and the gaps remind us that medieval lives do not always survive in clean sequences. Still, the pattern is clear. His world was larger than one cloister, shaped by travel, networks, and relationships. From an early age, he stood out for his literary skill. Even as a teenager, he was trusted with composing polished texts tied to the monastery's relationships with powerful figures. This tells us something important about Carolingian monasticism. A gifted monk could become a bridge between cloister and society. Writing, especially, was a form of contact with the outside world, a way for monastic communities to speak to kings, bishops, and other monasteries while still preserving their identity. His education connected him to notable teachers, and he became an intense collector of learning. He copied memorable passages from classical authors, gathered biblical explanations, and filled pages with notes taken at high speed. His method was not passive reading, but constant extraction and organization. Across many manuscripts, his marginal comments and inserted materials survive, showing a mind at work, comparing texts, assembling references, preparing lessons, and building a personal library of knowledge. What we see is not a distant scholar writing in abstraction, but a monastic teacher doing research inside the practical world of a monastery. In his early 20s, he began a major project focused on the monastery's patron saint, producing a long poetic account of the saint's life. Political change delayed the work, but he eventually completed it and offered it to the king, along with another book centered on miracles connected to the saint. This second work is especially revealing. Its purpose was not only to praise the saint, but to demonstrate that the monastery's spiritual power remained alive in the present. It is a window into the Carolingian idea that sacred life and everyday society must meet. Miracles were not placed in a distant golden age. They were presented as living realities that touched townspeople, pilgrims, and the monastery's own community. These works also show how monastic identity and public life overlapped. The monk wrote sermons for his fellow monks, yet he also addressed kings and moved within networks of elite patrons. Still, the monastery remained the center. The saint, the community, and the place itself formed the core around which everything turned. To make that story meaningful, the monk traced his saint's origins to late Roman Gaul. The saint began life with wealth and status, received a top-level education, and built a successful career in law and administration. Then came a dramatic shift. The local Christian community compelled him into religious leadership. Once in office, he adopted an image that stood apart from imperial grandeur. He was portrayed as a man of poverty, humility, and spiritual power, known less for formal writings and more for acts that convinced people heaven was close at hand. Germanus was not simply a local holy figure tied to one city. Even though Auxerre was his home base, his reputation was built on movement, travel, and public action. He crossed borders, entered political arenas, and stepped into conflicts that reached far beyond his own region. He traveled to Britain more than once to confront a major theological dispute, returning again to ensure the problem did not revive. Back in Gaul, He moved from place to place trying to ease the pressure of heavy taxation on ordinary people. He intervened when communities faced danger, including the threat of invasion, and he even pushed his way into the imperial center to secure protection for those he defended. His final journey ended at the imperial court, where he died in the mid-5th century. What made these travels unforgettable was the constant claim that miracles followed him everywhere. Wonders were said to occur in cities along the route, at sea while crossing the Channel, and even in the harsh passageways of the Alps. And when his body was carried home from Italy back to Auxerre, the stories did not fade. They multiplied. In the telling, the dead saint seemed even more powerful than the living one, as if the journey itself turned into a moving stage for public signs of divine presence. This wide geographic reach mattered later, especially in the Carolingian world. Several major monasteries became famous centers of power, pilgrimage, and influence, each tied to a prominent saint. Yet Germanus stood out because devotion to him spread unusually far. Places dedicated to him were not limited to a single region. They appeared across wide stretches of Western Europe, and stories of wonders were linked to many different locations. This gave his cult a special kind of authority. It felt international, not provincial. A 9th-century writer from Auxerre shaped this legacy into a vivid narrative designed to convince listeners that Germanus was still active. The miracle stories were not told in a vague, legendary haze. Names and places were used to make events feel specific and believable. The structure of the collection itself follows geography. It begins with events connected to Germanus's life and the return of his body to Gaul. Then it widens outward, moving across multiple regions associated with the saint. Finally, it pulls the focus inward again, narrowing back to Auxerre, to the church, and to the newly built crypt where Germanus rested alongside other revered figures. Even when the story traveled across Europe, it was always guided back to the monastery's heart. Time was also used as a tool. The narrative starts in the distant past, but steadily moves forward until it reaches the writer's own lifetime. Several miracles are anchored to identifiable years, and major political events appear in the background, making the saint's activity feel woven into real history. Important figures of the age are named, including kings, nobles, and bishops. This is not accidental. The point is clear. Germanus's power did not belong only to the age of late Rome. It reached straight into the Carolingian present. The audience matters here. Although the work was offered to the king, its tone and references suggest it was written with the monastery's own community in mind. Near the end, the writer turns directly toward monks and urges them to live with discipline, spiritual intensity, and awareness of their public impact. Yet a striking feature of the miracle stories is that monks themselves rarely take center stage. Instead, the narrative is crowded with lay people. The saint's wonders mostly unfold in ordinary lives, in households, fields, roads, and marketplaces. The monks remain present in another way, as the listeners and readers who receive these stories, bringing the outside world into the cloister through memory, reading, and reflection. Some miracles involve the powerful. One famous case centers on a leading noble who suffered a severe eye illness. Physicians failed. On the night before a painful medical procedure, fear drove him to the saint's shrine. In desperation, he pressed flowers from the shrine against his eye, and the pain vanished. The cure reshaped his life. In gratitude, he and his wife undertook a long restoration of the crypt, turning private healing into public building. Other noble stories are darker. A high-ranking lord treated a church dedicated to Germanus as if it were a roadside dining hall, letting his men eat there in casual disrespect. The response in the story is sharp and symbolic. His prized hunting birds died. Another man violated church land by grazing horses where he had no right. The animals were struck with sudden suffering until the offender repented and made a public offering. In these episodes, Germanus is not only healer, but guardian of sacred space, enforcing boundaries that society is tempted to ignore. But most of the miracles are told on a smaller scale, where the ordinary and the vulnerable stand in the foreground. A child, a woman, a blind person, unnamed villagers, and struggling families become the main characters. Women appear often in corrective stories tied to everyday labor. When certain women continued work on Sunday as if it were any other day, their hands were afflicted until repentance and prayer brought healing. Another woman entered the church pretending to pray, but intending to steal. Her body was paralyzed, and only public confession and communal prayer restored her. These are not subtle stories. They are designed to teach, warn, and reinforce moral order in a way that could be understood instantly by anyone listening. Priests appear now and then, usually in supporting roles, and one extended account focuses on a church connected to Germanus in the suburbs of a major city. The story emphasizes that the place was founded by worldly people who traveled widely for trade and believed Germanus protected them on dangerous journeys. A conflict over land boundaries then unfolds like a moral drama. A greedy neighbor secretly moved boundary stones at night to expand his own field. When the priest restored the markers, the neighbor tried again. Finally, the priest appealed to Germanus for help. The neighbor was struck with paralysis, carried publicly to the priest, and forced into days of repentance before being healed. The hidden crime becomes a public lesson, performed in front of witnesses, turning personal wrongdoing into communal memory. Crowds play a major role in the atmosphere of these stories. Miracles are repeatedly set in public spaces, festivals, and gatherings where excitement is already high and expectations are rising. One of the most dramatic events takes place during a major assembly of nobles. A poor mute girl arrived among the crowds, was denied help, and withdrew to a nearby chapel dedicated to Germanus. In the night, the saint appeared to her and restored her speech. The next morning her voice was the proof, along with visible signs that something shocking had happened to her throat. Because so many people from across the kingdom had come to the assembly, news traveled quickly and widely. A private moment became a public sensation. Festivals tied to Germanus were especially powerful settings for such events. The narrative repeatedly describes people pouring in, flowing together, filling streets and churches. Feast days were not quiet devotion. They were collective emotion, heightened anticipation, and the hope that the extraordinary might break into ordinary life. In one story, a group of monks realized too late that the local clergy had left to join the festivities, and no one remained to perform the required prayers at the proper hours. The monks rushed across the river to reach the church in time. The moment they stepped onto the threshold, the bells began ringing by themselves. They searched everywhere, but no human hand could be found. The scene is crafted for maximum impact, urgency, public festival energy, and a final sign that the saint is present and attentive. This is the deeper purpose of the miracle collection. It is not simply a list of wonders. It is a mechanism for bringing the world into the cloister without letting the cloister dissolve into the world. Through these stories, monks could feel the pressure of daily life outside their walls, witness fear and repentance, see the powerful humbled and the poor defended, and sense that their patron saint still acted in the present. The miracles create momentum. They require witnesses, storytellers, and crowds who spread news. They turn devotion into a shared social force. Not long ago, the scholar honored in this collection turned attention to the great teachers of the Carolingian world and invited readers to look back to an age when learning held a special place in society. That invitation drew listeners into a period shaped by renewal, discipline, and deep respect for education. At the heart of that world stood one defining bond: the relationship between teacher and student. It is to one such bond that we now turn, focusing on a monk who shaped his thought and writing around the memory of two revered abbots who had once guided him. This monk lived through repeated moments of separation from his mentors, caused not by choice, but by forced removal and political punishment. In such moments, it would not have been unusual for him to reflect on earlier figures who had endured similar losses. The experience of displacement was familiar to many intellectuals of the period. Even those who shaped the cultural revival of the age often felt like outsiders, especially when removed from the centers where teaching and learning once flourished. Expressions of longing for lost places of study reveal how deeply exile could wound those who lived by books, memory, and community. In a world where even the most celebrated teachers expressed their grief through the language of loss and displacement, it is hardly surprising that exile became a powerful idea within political and intellectual debate. During the 9th century, writers began to use the experience of banishment not only as a personal tragedy, but as a moral and political weapon. Through carefully crafted narratives, exile could be transformed into proof of injustice, a sign that power had been abused rather than rightly exercised. Within the Frankish realms, removal from society gradually emerged as one of the most common responses to political conflict. Other punishments existed, but exile proved especially useful in an age marked by constant instability. Its appeal lay in flexibility. It removed opponents without necessarily killing them and allowed rulers to demonstrate both authority and restraint. This practice drew on multiple traditions, but the strongest influence came from the legacy of Roman rule, where removal from the political body had long served as a tool against internal threats. Over time, the idea took hold that an offense against the ruler was more than a personal insult. It was an attack on the political order itself. Once this idea gained traction, banishment became closely tied to accusations of disloyalty at the highest level. Frankish rulers increasingly adopted this way of thinking as they claimed broader authority and framed themselves as guardians of public order. Long before formal imperial titles were revived, the language and logic of supreme authority were already shaping political practice. Early examples reveal how this mindset developed. A powerful regional ruler who resisted repeated summons was eventually forced into submission through overwhelming pressure. Although initial reconciliation seemed possible, suspicion lingered. When formal charges were finally brought, they centered on betrayal of rightful authority. Conviction followed, and exile became the chosen solution. The punishment extended beyond the individual to include family members and supporters, all sent into controlled religious settings. This pattern would repeat itself many times in the decades that followed. Once this logic was established, it shaped responses to nearly every serious challenge to ruling power. Even close relatives were not exempt. One dramatic case involved a royal son accused of plotting against his father. Although death was initially decreed, mercy intervened. The sentence was altered, and religious confinement replaced execution. Others involved in the same affair were treated more harshly, though some also avoided death through removal from public life. In this way, exile functioned as both punishment and containment. This approach was not limited to secular affairs. The same framework was applied to conflicts involving church leadership. When violence erupted against a leading religious figure, the response was framed not merely as an attack on a person, but as a violation of public order. Once innocence was formally declared, attention turned to the attackers. Their punishment followed the same logic used in political cases. Though death was prescribed by law, mercy prevailed. Life was spared, but removal from society was enforced. Here, authority was extended beyond the ruler himself to those under his protection, revealing how deeply this way of thinking had taken root. By the early 9th century, the idea that disrespect or arrogance toward the ruler could count as a serious offense had become widespread. Even behavior that fell short of open rebellion could be interpreted as a threat to authority. Accounts from the period describe rulers carefully observing those around them, searching for signs of pride or excess that might reveal hidden disloyalty. Such attitudes show how thoroughly the concept had been absorbed into political culture. As rebellions erupted toward the end of a long reign, exile once again moved to the center of events. It shaped not only the punishment of rebels, but also the process of reconciliation and restoration. When power shifted, those who had acted against the ruler were detained, judged, and disciplined. Yet execution was often avoided. Instead, removal from public life was chosen as a way to neutralize danger while preserving the possibility of future stability. In these moments, the tension between justice and mercy became clear. Some observers criticized what they saw as weakness, arguing that harsher punishment was deserved. Others recognized a deeper strategy at work. By avoiding irreversible decisions, rulers kept control over outcomes and reduced the risk of renewed violence. Exile, in this sense, was not merely a sign of leniency. It was a calculated tool designed to protect the fragile balance of power. What emerges from these patterns is a political culture that relied heavily on exclusion rather than elimination. Removal from society, enforced through religious confinement or distant placement, allowed authority to be asserted without closing all paths forward. In a world where loyalty was fragile and conflict constant, this flexibility became one of the defining features of rule. When we consider how power functioned in the Carolingian world, it becomes clear that exile was not an extraordinary event, but almost a routine risk of aristocratic life. Many nobles likely expected that at some point they would be removed from favor, at least temporarily. This expectation did not reflect blind submission to absolute authority. Instead, it revealed an unspoken agreement about how power was shared between rulers and elites. Authority was negotiated, not imposed unilaterally. The ruling family did not govern alone. Its dominance depended on the cooperation of powerful noble networks spread across the Frankish heartlands, including regions closest to the dynasty itself. At the same time, these nobles sought proximity to the ruler, knowing that influence and survival depended on access. The true engine of political tension lay in the granting and holding of offices that carried honor, prestige, and real authority. There were always more candidates than positions, and this imbalance fueled repeated crises. Much of the political turmoil of the 8th and 9th centuries can be understood as struggles over who would gain, lose, or regain these rewards. Seen in this light, exile appears less as a blunt punishment and more as a flexible tool. Its purpose was removal, not destruction. By sending rivals away rather than eliminating them, rulers preserved the possibility of reconciliation. This approach resonated with nobles as well, even when they were personally affected. Anger and resentment certainly followed the banishment of allies or relatives, but continued participation in the system shows that exile was broadly accepted as part of political life. Even judicial decisions reflected this shared understanding. Sentences announced publicly were often severe, but they were frequently followed by reductions to less final outcomes. Death penalties were commuted to exile, confinement, or physical impairment. These changes were not sudden acts of mercy inspired by absolute power. They were more likely steps within negotiated processes designed to stabilize the political order while allowing all parties to save face. Just as removal could be imposed, it could also be reversed. Loss of office, property, and status was not always permanent. Assemblies sometimes restored former rebels to favor only months after their disgrace. Such reversals were not simply expressions of kindness. They fulfilled the other side of an implicit contract. If elites accepted punishment, they could reasonably expect the chance of return. Those who had been cast out anticipated renewed access to resources and protection once loyalty was re-established. This expectation extended even beyond the Frankish world. Rulers recognized that banishment was a common political reality everywhere. They prepared for it. Refuge, property, and safe territories were provided in advance, anticipating future danger. When exile occurred, it was treated not as the end of political life, but as a temporary condition. The logic was clear. As long as someone remained alive, the door to restoration stayed open. Even the architects of exile acknowledged this reversibility. Removal was conceived as something that could be undone, recalled, or corrected. This belief shaped behavior on all sides. Those who fled did not always expect permanent loss. Many assumed they would return once circumstances shifted. Another striking feature of this system was its adaptability. Even the visible markers of exclusion could be undone. Forced religious confinement or symbolic acts meant to neutralize political threat did not always have lasting effect. Physical signs faded. Status could be reclaimed. Those once sidelined could reappear in public life with authority restored. Such flexibility underscores how provisional punishment often was. This elasticity explains why exile worked for so long. It balanced punishment with possibility. It removed immediate threats while avoiding irreversible outcomes. But it also carried risks. When expectations of return were repeatedly denied, frustration grew. When honor was not restored, elites did not remain passive. They responded with resistance, negotiation, or open challenge. Over time, debate intensified. What had once been widely accepted began to attract criticism. After the reign of the dynasty's most powerful ruler, questions emerged about how exile should be used and who had the right to impose it. The very arguments that had justified the practice were now turned against it. Exile had become so central to political culture that no single authority could fully control its meaning anymore. This shift reveals a paradox. A tool designed to preserve stability gradually became a source of contention. As elites asserted their stake in the political order, they claimed ownership over the rules governing punishment and restoration. Authority was no longer unquestioned. It was contested. The consequences became visible when punishment crossed perceived limits. When removal was accompanied by loss of property or public humiliation beyond accepted norms, outrage followed. Even rulers were forced to acknowledge boundaries to their power. Public acts of remorse and confession exposed the fragile balance between authority and consent. In moments of crisis, leading nobles confronted rulers directly, accusing them of violating shared norms. Exile, they argued, was legitimate only when exercised within agreed limits. To go beyond those limits was to undermine the very foundations of governance. Even voices generally sympathetic to royal authority hinted at disappointment when those expectations were ignored. What emerges is a picture of early medieval rule defined by negotiation. Power rested not in absolute command, but in constant adjustment. Exile was one of the most visible expressions of that reality. It could punish, restrain, and protect, but only as long as all parties believed it remained fair, temporary, and reversible. When that belief faltered, exile ceased to stabilize the system, and instead exposed its deepest tensions. This perspective, however, explains only part of the story. A ruler's refusal to recognize limits or to satisfy expectations of honor during moments of crisis addresses only immediate political pressure. To understand what truly unfolded, we must look deeper, beyond urgent calculations, toward the cultural meanings that shaped reactions and resistance. We must ask how those who felt wronged responded when they believed shared authority had been violated. Their actions reveal where the invisible boundaries of early medieval power truly lay and what political life in the Carolingian world actually meant. These questions come sharply into focus through the writings of a monk who devoted his voice to defending two abbots whose lives had been scarred by repeated removal and disgrace. His accounts were written to restore their reputations, praising their patience, restraint, and endurance under punishment they did not deserve. Yet these works did more than defend individuals. They articulated a broader argument about how far political power could justly reach, even when exercised by an emperor. What makes these texts especially striking is the author's willingness to use the intellectual tools of the Carolingian renewal itself against imperial authority. By doing so, he gave voice to a wider concern shared by many of his contemporaries. He became not only a defender of his mentors, but also a spokesperson for a vision of shared sovereignty and for the unexpected tensions produced by the cultural revival of the age, particularly where imperial power and religious authority collided. Few cases illustrate these tensions more clearly than the lives of two half-brothers closely tied to the ruling dynasty. Both men stood near the center of power, served faithfully, and yet experienced dramatic reversals of fortune. Their biographer knew them intimately, first as a monk formed under their guidance, and later as their successor. Through his writings, their lives are preserved in remarkable detail. These brothers were born into privilege and blood ties that placed them close to the throne. Each served the ruler in different capacities, advising kings, managing major institutions, and participating in military and administrative affairs. One enjoyed steady trust for many years, while the other endured suspicion and early disgrace before being restored. Together they embodied both the promise and the peril of proximity to power. Everything changed with the death of the great ruler they had served. The new regime acted swiftly. One brother was stripped of position, property, and influence, and sent away to an isolated religious community. The other withdrew into monastic life. Years later, both were unexpectedly restored, their disgrace publicly acknowledged as unjust. These reversals were followed by moments of deep humiliation for the ruler himself, as he sought forgiveness for earlier actions. Yet stability did not last. Renewed political conflict once again swept the brothers into turmoil. One was removed repeatedly, passed from place to place, deprived of authority, and finally pushed beyond the political heartland altogether. His final years were spent far from the centers he once shaped. The other had already died, leaving his disciple to watch events unfold with growing concern and resolve. Throughout these years, the biographer observed closely. As doubts spread about the justice of political punishment, he used his writings to challenge prevailing assumptions. In one powerful work, he redefined the very meaning of removal. True disgrace, he argued, belonged not to the one sent away unjustly, but to those who imposed such punishment without cause. Removal became shameful only when deserved. When inflicted upon the innocent, it revealed the moral failure of the powerful. At the heart of his argument stood a single standard: wrongdoing. Only those guilty of real moral failure could justly be removed. By this measure, his mentors were blameless. The question, then, was unavoidable. Who had truly acted against justice and order? In an earlier work, he went even further. He challenged not only the fairness of punishment, but the source of authority itself. He argued that the ultimate agent behind suffering was not the ruler, but God. Trials were permitted to refine virtue, not to signal disgrace. By framing events this way, he quietly stripped political power of its final authority and placed judgment in divine hands. He reinforced this claim through dramatic scenes. Even as punishment was imposed, those who understood its meaning recognized that it granted freedom rather than humiliation. Those sent away appeared calmer, more confident, and more joyful than those who wielded power against them. The ruler, confronted with this reality, was left exposed and ashamed. Alongside theological argument, the author drew on legal and political language familiar to his audience. He turned the logic of supreme authority on itself. The problem, he suggested, was not disloyalty, but fidelity to higher principles. When service to God conflicted with obedience to earthly power, the former must prevail. In this light, supposed betrayal became true loyalty to the deeper order of the realm. This rhetorical move reveals something crucial. Concepts once used to justify punishment were now being reclaimed by those resisting arbitrary power. The question was no longer simply whether authority had been offended, but whose authority truly mattered. Was it the ruler alone, or the community as a whole? This debate did not arise in isolation. The cultural revival of the age had spread learning far beyond the ruling family. Many members of the elite were deeply engaged with texts, ideas, and historical models. They possessed the tools to articulate opposition in sophisticated terms. As a result, political discipline itself became a subject of contestation. Removal from public life was no longer merely a practical solution to conflict. It became a symbol of deeper struggles over justice, power, and legitimacy. The very practice that had once stabilized the system now provoked debate about its rightful limits. These tensions help explain both the vitality and the fragility of Carolingian political life. The same intellectual energy that strengthened the system also undermined unquestioned authority. Yet within this turbulence, we can see the emergence of a serious conversation about governance, responsibility, and restraint. Removal could be many things at once. It could express dominance, offer compromise, preserve peace, or reflect divine will. Its meaning shifted depending on perspective. Far from causing confusion, this complexity reveals the true character of the age. Political life was defined by debate, negotiation, and the constant testing of boundaries. Among those navigating this contested landscape, few understood it more deeply than the devoted biographer who sought to restore his mentor's honor. His familiarity with loss, displacement, and argument gave him the insight needed to challenge power with its own language and to expose the fragile line separating authority from injustice. According to Ralph Gleiber, the surge in crowds moving toward Jerusalem in the late 1025s and early 1035s stirred an unsettling question in the minds of contemporaries. What did it mean that so many people, in numbers never seen before, were setting out toward the same destination? Some commentators did not state it openly, but they hinted at it nonetheless. This movement might be a sign of the great evil believed to appear as the end of the world drew near. In their view, a path would open in the east. Peoples would stream toward it. A great confrontation would take place, and in those days even the most steadfast would be shaken. Yet the same account chooses silence at this point, emphasizing instead that the labors of those who traveled in faith would not go unrewarded, and that justice would ultimately prevail. It is precisely here that historians enter the debate. Did the picture painted by Gleiber truly reflect widespread fears of the age, or was he consciously highlighting particular years in order to give his narrative greater force, constructing a literary framework around them? Many scholars lean toward the latter interpretation. Still, the question remains: why did Jerusalem become such a powerful center of attraction during these years? The answer is too broad to fit within the bounds of a single text. For this reason, our attention turns to another important chronicler of the same century. A monk named Adhemar, who traveled to Jerusalem in 1033, was more than a simple pilgrim. When one looks at what he wrote, the texts he collected, and the stories he chose to preserve, it becomes clear that Jerusalem was more than a place for him. In the works he prepared toward the end of his life, Jerusalem appears not merely as a destination, but as a sign. In his world, it stood at the intersection of sacred memories of the past and anxieties about the future. Adhemar had been formed within the powerful monastic circles of southern France, a productive figure who worked in the scriptorium with text, music, and image alike. The traces he left in manuscripts that circulated from hand to hand point to intense interest in liturgy, hymns, drawings, and above all, sacred history. His habit of revising his chronicle repeatedly and continually expanding the history of his own community shows that, in his mind, history was not a static record, but a living narrative. At a certain point, however, Adhemar's life took a decisive turn. In the 1020s, he became one of the leading figures in a campaign to elevate Saint Martial to a higher level of sanctity. This effort suffered a serious blow in 1029, when it met with strong external opposition. After this moment, a defensive tone becomes increasingly visible in Adhemar's writings. Rather than ending the debate, he writes more. While trying to preserve his earlier claims, he also begins to dwell more insistently on the idea of the approaching last days. In this atmosphere, preparations to travel to Jerusalem in 1033 become not merely a plan for a journey, but a turning point. Jerusalem appears again and again in his texts. One reason for this lies in the daily monastic rhythm, where psalms repeatedly invoke Jerusalem. Yet Adamar's interest grows on a more personal level. He links Saint Martial to Jerusalem, imagines him as a figure close to Christ there, and insists that a spirit of mission carried from Jerusalem eventually reached Limoges. In doing so, he draws an invisible line between Limoges and Jerusalem. For Adamar, Jerusalem is not simply a distant holy city, but a source placed at the very center of his local religious world. This approach becomes even clearer when compared with Rome. In Adamar's defensive writings, Rome recedes into the background, while Jerusalem is presented as the primary source. In his view, the law of faith and the Word of God originally spread from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Zion, the mother of all churches. These statements reveal the hierarchy in his mind. Jerusalem is a point of origin, a root, an initial center. Adamar also collects the travel stories of his own age. His texts are filled with people constantly on the move. Men and women setting out from Aquitaine head eastward, some by land, others by sea. Details about opened routes, safer passages, the overland road through Hungary, the danger of pirates in the Mediterranean, conflicts in southern Italy, and tensions with Muslims and Byzantines all show how real and how dangerous the road to Jerusalem appeared in his world. He also mentions a guide monk who traveled back and forth to the west, a man who had spent years guiding pilgrims in Jerusalem, then withdrawn to Sinai, and later returned westward, where he met Adamar. Such an encounter could easily ignite a monk's imagination. Jerusalem was no longer confined to texts. It entered his world through living testimony. Adamar also recounts the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 by the Caliph in Cairo, and describes the shock this news caused in the West. He does not know every detail or record every reaction, but he conveys the resonance of the event in southern France. He highlights in particular how a local count and large numbers of people set out eastward in response. These pilgrims went and returned, telling stories and carrying news. Adamar's own journey thus ceases to be an isolated decision. It becomes part of a larger movement, following paths already traced by others. In the background of this narrative stands another towering figure, Charlemagne. In Adamar's chronicle, Charlemagne is not merely a king, but a model, a sign, even a symbol extending toward the horizon of the end times. Adamar delights in stories that link Charlemagne to Jerusalem. A shroud said to have come from the Holy Sepulchre, relics sent to Limoges, fragments of the cross, tales surrounding Charlemagne's tomb at Aachen, and the story that Otto found him seated upright when the tomb was opened. All these elements strengthen Charlemagne's bond with the cross. In Adamar's mind, the cross is not only a memory of the past, but a sign of the approaching Great Reckoning. In this sense, Charlemagne appears almost as a new Constantine. The story of Helena, Constantine's mother, discovering the cross also occupies an important place in Adamar's writings, and once again forges a link between Jerusalem and Limoges. Seen from this perspective, the unity of Adamar's final compilations becomes clearer. What begins with interpretations of texts such as the Acts of the Apostles and Revelation gradually draws inward towards Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, and the last times. At one point, Adamar states that the exact time of the Antichrist's coming cannot be known. Yet the pull of Jerusalem remains strong. The mind moves toward what it does not know. This is less a claim to knowledge than a direction of longing befitting the spirit of the age. In the later part of the compilation, the journey of the Apostle Paul to Jerusalem is recounted. Paul hurries in order to arrive at a specific time. Along the way, he recalls what he has endured, speaks of tears and trials, and says that he did not turn back despite the hostility he faced. He openly admits that he does not know what awaits him in Jerusalem. And yet he walks on. He accepts the possibility of hardship and chains, valuing the completion of his mission more than his own life. A farewell scene follows. Friends weep, embrace him, kiss him, grieve at the thought that they may never see his face again, and accompany him to the ship. For a monk preparing to set out for the East in 1033, this scene is not merely a story from the distant past. It is also a mirror. To travel to Jerusalem is to walk toward the unknown. The community left behind, the tears, the anxiety, the prayers, all of these belong equally to the 1st century and the 11th. This is why, in Adamar's writings, Jerusalem is not just a place on a map, but a call that grows within the human heart. As Adamar prepared to leave for Jerusalem, several late writings offer rare insight into his inner world. One short text survives in a manuscript now kept in Princeton. It takes the form of a brief prayer, but its language is striking. Again and again, one word returns: come. The word appears nearly 30 times, creating a sense of urgency and expectation. This repetition echoes the final call found at the close of the book of Revelation, where Christ is invited to return. At the same time, the prayer draws on the prophetic vision of Isaiah, where all nations are imagined streaming toward the mountain of the Lord in the last days, seeking divine law and judgment from Jerusalem. In this small text, Jerusalem is not simply a destination. It becomes the gathering place of history itself, the point where time is drawn inward toward its conclusion. Another piece, likely written very close to Adamar's departure, survives as a short note in a Vatican manuscript. It records a solar eclipse that occurred in early summer 1033. Many observers claimed to see the shape of a human face within the darkened sun. Adamar himself says he did not see such a figure, yet the event clearly left its mark. In a world where celestial signs were read as messages, the dimming of the sun could hardly be ignored. For many in that year, it confirmed a sense that the final age was approaching. For Adamar, it likely reinforced his resolve to set out for Jerusalem. No further writings from him survive. What is known, however, is that he did make the journey, and that he did not return. A later librarian at St. Martial recorded that Adamar died in 1034 and passed to Christ in Jerusalem. It is possible that he was among the many who lost their lives during the devastating earthquake that struck the city and its surroundings in December 1033. If so, his pilgrimage ended not in return, but in death. The hope that seems to have guided him, the hope of meeting Christ with the pilgrim monks on the Mount of Olives at the final judgment, was not fulfilled in the way his imagination may have envisioned. He did not witness the last emperor laying down his crown, nor did he see the blazing cross appear in the sky. Yet his journey did lead to something else. He reached a peace beyond earthly promises, and perhaps the vision of the heavenly Jerusalem itself, joining those who eternally worship the Lamb. He rests in peace. From this personal story, we turn to a much larger question, one that has shaped how the Middle Ages are still explained today. There exists a long-standing model that describes medieval political order as a rigid hierarchy. By the late 12th century, thinkers in both church and government certainly imagined authority as layered, mirroring a heavenly order. Over time, this idea has been simplified into a familiar image, a neat pyramid with king or pope at the top, powerful nobles beneath, local lords below them, and peasants at the base. This picture appears so often that it feels natural, yet its origins deserve closer examination. For many years, scholars assumed that this hierarchical vision emerged from early medieval political structures, especially those associated with the Carolingian world. According to this view, systems of lordship shaped monastic organization, particularly influential religious communities, which then passed this hierarchical mindset on to the papacy. This explanation became so familiar that it faded into the background, rarely questioned. Yet recent scholarship has challenged every part of this sequence. Rather than abandoning the model altogether, it may be time to reverse it. Instead of hierarchy flowing from kings to monks to popes, the evidence suggests a different path. The idea of structured authority appears to have taken shape first within the papacy, then spread into monastic life, and only later influenced secular government. Seen this way, the major church conflicts of the 11th century are not side episodes, but central turning points for understanding how medieval power was imagined and organized. The older model rested on the assumption that early medieval society was already arranged as a stable ladder of authority. Kings were thought to stand at the center, surrounded by nobles who in turn controlled their own followers. This arrangement was then believed to have inspired the internal structure of major monastic networks, which organized dependent communities around a central house. Over time, this monastic pattern was said to have shaped the reorganization of the church itself, placing the pope at the summit, followed by archbishops, bishops, and local clergy. But this story begins to unravel when examined closely. The political arrangements of the Carolingian world were far more fluid than later systems. Officials appointed to govern regions were not bound by the lifelong ties that later generations would expect. They could be removed or reassigned without resistance. Power was delegated, not permanently granted. When positions later became hereditary, they were treated as personal possessions, not as offices requiring renewed loyalty at each generation. The rigid bonds that define later medieval structures simply did not yet exist. In other words, the tidy pyramid so often presented did not belong to the early Middle Ages at all. If it developed anywhere, it did so much later. The assumption that early political practice provided a ready-made model for religious and institutional hierarchy no longer holds. What emerges instead is a picture of gradual construction, shaped by religious ideas before they were fully absorbed into secular rule. Understanding this reversal matters. It reshapes how the development of medieval government, religious reform, and authority itself are understood. Hierarchy was not simply inherited from ancient kingship. It was built, argued over, and refined within the church before it became a framework for political life. And at the heart of this transformation stood moments of conflict, belief, and imagination that continue to shape how the medieval world is remembered. For a long time, it was assumed that landholding based on personal obligation had already existed in the early medieval world. If this were true, then the systems seen later would merely be the continuation of something far older. But this assumption rests on a misunderstanding that echoes mistakes made centuries ago. What we now understand is that this form of landholding did not grow out of the early medieval past at all. It emerged as something new in the 11th century. During the same decades when private fortresses spread across the countryside and mounted warriors became a permanent feature of local power, new demands began to appear. Local strongmen claimed rights over markets, roads, and justice. In this environment, personal land agreements began to take shape. These arrangements were improvised, flexible, and often contradictory. Two men might each owe loyalty to the other for different properties. There was no clear ladder of authority, and kings were not involved at the beginning. England moved more quickly than most regions in tying these relationships to royal power. After the conquest, rulers insisted that major landholders owed their holdings directly to the crown. Even so, these arrangements were not immediately stable or permanent. On the mainland, it was not until much later that rulers actively tried to convince powerful regional lords that they were part of a royal chain of dependence. Once rulers adopted this idea, they promoted it vigorously, presenting it as ancient tradition. In reality, it was a political project, not a reflection of everyday society. Since this vision only took clear shape late in the 12th century, it cannot have served as a model for earlier religious institutions. This realization undermines the first pillar of the traditional explanation. The idea that hierarchical thinking began in early medieval political life simply does not hold. The second pillar also collapses under closer scrutiny. It was long believed that a major religious center created its own layered structure, with dependent communities arranged beneath it like branches of a tree. But closer study reveals a very different picture. Before the 12th century, reforms carried out by leading monasteries were irregular and temporary. Relationships were personal, not institutional. Some communities became dependent, others retained full independence. In many cases, reforms lasted only as long as the reforming leader lived. Sharing similar religious practices did not mean belonging to a unified system. Only much later, in response to internal pressures and by borrowing ideas from newer movements, did this religious network begin to resemble a structured hierarchy. The third assumption fares no better. The leaders of the Church in the 11th and 12th centuries are no longer seen as drawing their ideas from earlier monastic models. Many of them came from regions where those monasteries had little influence. Instead, the foundations of their authority rested on older legal traditions and writings that emphasized the universal role of church leadership. When legal thinkers debated authority, they looked to early church figures and sacred precedent, not to contemporary religious communities. At the same time, the goals of earlier monasteries often conflicted with later reform ideals. Rather than separating religious life from the world, many sought cooperation with local elites. Their leaders depended on secular approval and worked to turn rivals into allies. This approach stood far from the later vision of a sharp divide between religious and worldly power. It therefore becomes difficult to argue that church reform was simply an expanded version of monastic organization. Yet, despite the collapse of every supporting argument, the old explanation has endured. Even now, it is often assumed that political hierarchy grew out of religious hierarchy, which in turn grew out of early landholding practices. We suggest turning this entire model upside down. Instead of seeing church reform as the final stage of an older system, we see it as the starting point. The rethinking of authority within the church reshaped religious life and only later influenced political organization. The major conflicts of the late 11th century were not an echo of earlier structures. They were the moment when a new vision of order was first clearly articulated. Although modern research has shifted toward social and spiritual themes, this does not diminish the importance of those conflicts. On the contrary, many developments of the 12th century cannot be understood without them. Ideas about authority, order, and structure flowed outward from this moment, shaping institutions far beyond the church itself. This influence can be seen most clearly in newer religious movements that emerged at the time. Unlike earlier communities, these groups maintained constant contact with church leadership and accepted oversight from above. Their internal organization mirrored the broader structure of the church. Authority flowed downward in clearly defined stages, and responsibility flowed upward in regular reporting. Rules governing relations between communities formalized this structure. Each foundation knew its place within a larger system. Regular inspections, annual gatherings, and shared standards created a level of unity never seen before. This approach proved highly influential. Other religious groups adopted similar methods, and even older communities eventually followed suit. Secular rulers were watching. They did not need direct instruction to recognize the advantages of such an orderly system. Across Europe, leaders began to experiment with similar models. Powerful nobles pressured local strongmen to acknowledge their authority. Written records listed dependents and obligations. Courts organized their followers in ways that closely resembled religious networks. It is no coincidence that regions where these political experiments advanced most rapidly were also those with the strongest presence of the new religious movements. Rulers supported these communities, protected them, and learned from their example. By the time political hierarchy became clearly defined, religious hierarchy had already provided a working model. Around the year 1000, a powerful idea circulated among churchmen. Society could be imagined as three intertwined callings. Some people prayed, some fought, and others worked. The striking claim was not only that these roles existed, but that they formed a single body that could not be separated without tearing the whole. This picture has fascinated later generations for a reason. It sounds like a description of the world, but it also sounds like a blueprint for how the world ought to be arranged. The hardest question is whether this three-part vision was meant to report reality or to shape it. What becomes clear when we look closer is that the borders between these roles were never as solid as the theory suggests. The religious world, in particular, sat right on the fault line. Many people who spent their later years in prayer began their lives in families trained for violence and leadership. Later, reformers often preferred to present a clean break. The moment someone entered religious life, all ties to a warrior household supposedly ended. But the surviving evidence from the region around Chartres points in a different direction. Noble families did not send children into religious communities the way one discards what is unwanted. Placement inside the church was usually planned with the same seriousness as a marriage alliance. It was a choice designed to strengthen a family's position, to build lasting connections with sacred places, holy figures, and the prestige that came with them. Rather than serving as storage for surplus sons and daughters, religious houses became one of the main ways families expanded their influence into the spiritual realm. This was not new. Even earlier centuries show that the world outside did not stay outside for long. The ideal monastery plans of the past sometimes included spaces intended for visitors and secular business, a quiet admission that religious life would always be entangled with the society around it. Monks themselves often welcomed contact with the wider world. And in the central Middle Ages, communities around Chartres continued this pattern. Records of property transfers reveal that entering religious life did not automatically erase a person's stake in family affairs. People who joined religious institutions could still be tied to family property and could still matter inside their birth households. Lists of the dead preserved by monasteries also hint at something deeper. Emotional bonds to family endured for a lifetime. Joining the church was rarely an individual act. Families had to approve it. Children needed parental permission, and married adults needed agreement from a spouse. In return, church placement offered a pathway to respect and advancement for both the individual and the family. Over time, certain church roles circulated within the same kin groups again and again, turning spiritual service into a pattern that could look almost hereditary. In the Chartres region, we even find major positions passing from an older relative to a younger one, though not every family could hold such influence for long. Family connections also shaped where newcomers were placed. When an elite woman decided that her grandson should enter religious life, she did not choose at random. She placed him where members of the family were already serving. Another young man entered the same house because his brother held authority there. Later, another noble became a monk in a community his family had supported for generations, and the presence of a close relative already inside likely made the transition smoother. These were not accidents. They were deliberate choices that kept family networks intact. And nobles did not enter religious life only as children. Many arrived later, after years spent in the world. The reasons are not always spelled out, but sometimes the documents reveal a human story. One man entered with no explanation at all, as if the decision required none. Another turned toward the cloister after being wounded in war, no longer able to fight. One knight, still relatively young, was described as being seized by a sudden spiritual impulse and leaving his former life behind. He had already built alliances, proven himself, and taken his place among the warriors of his region. Yet something shifted. Whether the violence repelled him, whether faith had always pulled at him, or whether the absence of a wife and children made the step easier, the result was the same. He abandoned the life of arms and joined a brotherhood. In later life, the pattern becomes even clearer. Aging warriors often faced the realities of illness, weakness, and the need for care. Religious houses were well positioned to receive them. Many had facilities for the sick, and people trained to treat them. For an old noble, retirement in such a place could mean both practical support and spiritual preparation. We find men who, fearing death, asked to be received and offered gifts of land, money, food, drink, and sacred books to secure their new place. A century later, another aged knight, worn down and no longer active, expressed the desire to leave worldly life and spend his remaining days in the clothing and routine of a monk. Because generation after generation returned to the same communities, long relationships formed between noble households and particular religious houses. When a family member lived inside a monastery or a religious chapter, relatives often gave gifts to that same foundation. These donations strengthened reputation, supported the family's hope for salvation, and increased the resources and influence of the religious community. We even see cases where a churchman gave property to a monastery in memory of relatives, and the reason becomes clear once we notice that close kin were already monks there. Families tended to favor the institutions where their own people had entered, retired, or been buried. The spiritual choices of one relative could guide the generosity of the whole household. So what happened to family ties after someone entered religious life? The evidence suggests those ties did not vanish. A memorial list from Chartres shows that noble families continued to treat monks and churchmen as their own. When a young churchman died, his father gave land for his soul, even after having already offered support at the time of his son's entry. The bond between uncle and nephew also remained strong and could even deepen. We see gifts made on behalf of priestly uncles, and later we see nephews commemorating the deaths of their clerical relatives. In one case, an older churchman grew ill and decided to become a monk. His nephews did not stay distant. They traveled to confirm his donation and swore to defend it against challenges. Modern observers have sometimes imagined noble children placed in monasteries as if they were discarded. But the surviving records point to the opposite. These sons and daughters were not thrown away when they entered the church. They remained part of the family's story. Gifts, legal protections, careful placement, and lasting commemoration all show that family continued to shape clerical lives long after the cloister door had closed. Even in communities that preached renunciation, the pull of land and family responsibilities rarely disappeared overnight. The ideal was simple. Once someone stepped into religious life, the world outside was supposed to fall away. Yet the records from the region around Chartres show something more complicated and far more human. Men who entered religious houses often carried their family obligations with them, and property remained the thread that kept the two worlds tied together. We can see this clearly in the story of a man who spent many years as a mounted warrior before choosing the monastic path. When he joined, he gave part of his holdings connected to a mill, presenting it as a spiritual offering. But the gift also served a practical family purpose. It opened the way for one of his sons to enter the church as well. Even after withdrawing from worldly life, he continued to guide how family resources were used and how his child's future would be arranged. This was not a private decision made in isolation. His wife and their children traveled with him to confirm the arrangement, showing that the household as a whole stood behind the plan. Another example makes the same point even more bluntly. A monk, speaking alongside his young son, transferred income collected at the family stronghold, declaring it a gift for the good of their souls and those of their relatives. The language is revealing. Even in religious clothing, he still spoke as someone who belonged to that fortress and those rites. He acted with his child, and he gave from wealth he still clearly felt connected to. Religious vows did not erase identity, memory, or responsibility. Sometimes these acts carried grief as well as strategy. One monk made a donation in the wake of personal tragedy, offering it in memory of a son who had died. His wife and surviving sons agreed to the gift, including one who had already entered clerical life. This tells us something important. Becoming a monk did not cancel fatherhood. Family sorrow still shaped decisions, and the monk still had access to resources that made such a memorial gift possible. Again and again, property kept religious men and women linked to their families of birth. Gifts often came from personal holdings, but clerical relatives also remained involved in decisions about wider family assets. We find monks giving consent when brothers offered land, and in some cases receiving compensation, a quiet admission that even a cloistered relative could have a stake in the family's resources. The religious life did not always end claims. It sometimes reshaped them. Even high-ranking churchmen could be pulled into these struggles. In one case, a nephew who had asserted rights over church property was required to withdraw his claim publicly in front of multiple religious communities. He performed the renunciation in stages, first before his uncle, who was a bishop, then before the cathedral clergy, and finally before a monastery leadership. Several clerical relatives witnessed the process. This was not random ceremony. It was family and institution intertwined. The bishop's role can be read two ways, as duty to office and as family authority. In practice, it was likely both. The nephew was brought back into line through a mixture of spiritual obligation and kin pressure. A similar double role appears when an abbot helped his nephew confirm a donation after the death of the nephew's father, who died while traveling on pilgrimage. The abbot had an institutional reason to secure the confirmation, but he also acted as an uncle, guiding a young heir through a dangerous moment of transition. In this kind of world, religious leadership and family leadership could overlap, and the same person could serve both with the same action. Sometimes monks went even further, actively shaping how family property moved. We meet brothers who transferred a church to a monastery together, even though one of them had already entered religious life. Another monk in their extended family encouraged them to produce a formal written record of the gift. That advice served everyone. It displayed the family's devotion, strengthened the monastery's claim, and discouraged future disputes. In that moment, the monk was not torn between loyalties. His actions protected both the community he served and the family he came from. He also acted as a bridge between two cultures, the aristocratic world that relied on spoken agreement and personal memory, and the monastic world that increasingly trusted the written word as a shield against conflict. These clerics often became negotiators when disputes threatened to explode. Consider a monk who acquired land for his community from a widow. The purchase was carefully prepared with permissions and compensations meant to prevent trouble. Yet a powerful heir still challenged it. The crisis was resolved only through the intervention of other monks who had experience in secular landholding and negotiation. Their background mattered. Communities valued monks who understood the language of property, honor, and local power because they could speak to nobles in terms that nobles recognized. Blood ties could make mediation even more effective. In one early 12th century conflict, two sons pressed claims to certain church-related revenues that they believed belonged to them by inheritance. Their father, now an elderly monk, summoned them to the monastery. Even behind monastery walls, he continued to act as the head of his household. He urged his sons to abandon their claim and restore what they held to the church. Here, the monk served two roles at once: a member of the religious community seeking justice for his house, and a father using influence to discipline his heirs. Reform ideals were not merely preached at families from outside. In cases like this, they were carried into the household through a relative who had joined the church. We also find the story of a knight from a prominent local family who exchanged his sword for monastic life. His entry was backed by relatives who gave consent to the property offered with his transition. Later, his brother donated the remaining portion of the same holding, and this second gift was explicitly tied to the prayers and support of the monk brother. The monastery benefited twice, gaining full control of the place. The former knight rose within the monastery's administration as well, taking on responsibilities that required managing resources and supplies. His earlier life prepared him for it. He understood property, logistics, and authority, and those skills could be repurposed inside a religious community. Yet his story did not end inside monastery walls. He continued to appear in local acts tied to his family's region, especially when disputes involved forest rights, customs, and competing claims among lords. In one settlement, the agreement was reached through his hand, a phrase that points to direct personal influence. He helped persuade a powerful relative to surrender contested rights, allowing peace to be made between nobles and monks. The settlement was carefully validated by a wide circle of kin through witness and compensation, showing how seriously both sides took the danger of future challenges. Notably, the monk stood out as the key figure representing a branch of the family that otherwise remained absent from the document. Even though he was supposed to be removed from secular life, he functioned as the family's representative in a crucial local negotiation. Across these stories, one pattern emerges with clarity. For many in the 11th and 12th centuries, entering religious life did not mean erasing the old world. Instead, it meant standing with one foot in each realm. Sometimes that created tension, but often it brought advantages. Monks and clerics could calm disputes, translate between competing expectations, and move property and authority in ways that served both monastery and family. Far from becoming isolated, they often became the most effective connectors in a society where faith, kinship, and land were never truly separate. At the end of the 11th century, Bernard continued to act as a bridge between his family and the religious community he now served. In one case, two brothers connected to the lands around Fréteval decided to sell part of their property to a monastery. The agreement nearly collapsed when no one could clearly remember where the borders between their land and the Lord's domain actually lay. The deadlock was broken only when an older relative stepped forward and testified from memory. Once again, Bernard stood at the center of the process, guiding relatives, dependents, and churchmen through a delicate negotiation that required trust on all sides. A few years later, Bernard was drawn back into the same web. Another member of his family challenged a sale that Bernard himself had helped arrange earlier. Because he had been involved from the beginning, responsibility fell to him to calm the dispute. He summoned the dissatisfied kinsman to a neutral place where the disagreement was finally settled. Even though Bernard lived as a monk, much of his energy was still spent untangling family property issues. His monastery clearly relied on his background, his knowledge of local affairs, and his access to influential relatives to manage these situations. Bernard's family connections also brought him into the orbit of higher authority. When a count granted forest land to the monks, the count openly acknowledged that the decision had been influenced by the persuasion of Bernard and another monk. Bernard knew how to speak to powerful people in a language they respected. He understood how to frame generosity as a gift that honored ancestors, protected descendants, and secured spiritual reward. Yet his role did not end when the gift was made. When parts of the grant were later contested by his own uncle, Bernard once again stepped in to negotiate a settlement that protected the monastery's claim. Disputes rarely ended with a single agreement. After one donation, another religious community challenged the grant. The countess overseeing the region intervened and called representatives from both sides to her court. Bernard was among those summoned, not simply as a monk, but as someone deeply involved in the original transaction and closely associated with the land in question. His presence reflected the respect he commanded among both religious leaders and secular rulers. Bernard was already familiar with such courts. Earlier, a powerful relative had challenged the monastery's rights to a particular estate. The case was heard publicly, with both sides presenting their claims. The ruling favored the monks, and the challenger eventually withdrew. Once again, Bernard had helped guide a relative toward compromise, balancing loyalty to his family with commitment to his religious house. Bernard's life shows how kinship ties could reach straight through monastery walls. His experience of secular politics, his confidence in negotiation, his family standing, and his ability to speak persuasively to those in power made him especially valuable. He was not simply a monk withdrawn from the world. He was a mediator operating in the narrow space where noble households and religious institutions overlapped. After the first years of the 12th century, Bernard fades from the records. Another monk took over his administrative role, and Bernard either passed away or finally stepped back from the demands of mediation. Whether he experienced these responsibilities as a burden or as a mark of honor is impossible to know. What is clear is that he did not cut himself off from his family. He continued to use the same family name he shared with his brothers, a choice that signaled ongoing identification with his kin. Through court sessions, donations, and negotiated settlements, Bernard regularly encountered his relatives. These moments offered opportunities not only to resolve disputes, but also to maintain personal bonds, exchange news, and preserve a sense of belonging. Members of his family visited him at the monastery, sometimes appearing as witnesses to transactions even when they had no legal stake in the matter. Their presence suggests that they were there not as claimants, but as visitors. The pattern is unmistakable. Family ties remained strong and continued to draw monks into the affairs of the secular world. Sometimes this involvement may have been unavoidable. In other cases, monks deliberately used their dual experience of noble life and religious discipline to benefit both their community and their kin. Bernard's story captures this balance with unusual clarity. He stands as an example of how the cloister was never entirely sealed off from the world beyond its walls, and how some monks became indispensable figures precisely because they belonged to both. Religious men did not abandon the memory of their families when they entered monastic life. Just like nobles who remained in the world, monks and churchmen carefully marked the deaths of their relatives and ensured that prayers were offered for their souls. In many cases, joining a religious community only deepened their concern for family remembrance. In one community near Chartres, this practice became so widespread that the abbot decided to impose order on it. Instead of scattered observances throughout the year, all prayers for parents and close kin were gathered into a single annual commemoration. Other communities adopted similar solutions, choosing one fixed day when monks would collectively remember their families. These efforts suggest that prayer for relatives had grown so frequent that it threatened to overwhelm the rhythm of communal life. Yet the attempt to streamline remembrance was only partially successful. Death dates of clerical relatives continued to be recorded individually, showing that personal memory remained powerful. By examining who was remembered and how often, we gain insight into which family bonds endured most strongly within religious life. One window into this world comes from the writings of a 12th century monk who reflected deeply on his upbringing. His relationship with his mother dominated his memories and shaped his inner life. Modern readers have sometimes treated this bond as unusual. Yet, when we turn to the memorial records from the region around Chartres, it becomes clear that such maternal attachment was far from rare. These records were designed to list those considered worthy of prayer. Alongside fellow monks and benefactors, we repeatedly find the mothers of clerics. Their names appear far more often than any other family members. Fathers, by contrast, are strikingly absent. While monks clearly identified their parentage, only the deaths of mothers were regularly recorded. This pattern suggests that clerics felt a deeper emotional or spiritual closeness to their mothers than to their fathers. Many mothers were more closely aligned with religious life, more supportive of education, and more present in the spiritual formation of their sons than warrior fathers who lived in a very different world. The remembrance of mothers extended across all levels of church life. From ordinary monks to abbots and bishops, mothers were singled out for prayer and commemoration. Sometimes land or gifts accompanied these entries, but often no material offering was involved at all. The act of remembrance itself was the point. These women were honored not because of donations, but because of who they were and the role they played within powerful families. For church leaders, commemorating their mothers also reinforced family standing. High office often depended on family networks, especially through maternal lines. By honoring a mother's memory, a bishop or abbot quietly reminded both religious and secular audiences of the lineage that supported his position. These acts of remembrance were not simply private gestures. They were public affirmations of family identity and influence. In some cases, the importance of maternal kin becomes especially clear. One church leader arranged prayers for his mother, a woman from a distinguished noble family whose connections stretched deep into the region's power structures. Her standing likely played a role in her son's rise. By remembering her publicly, he reaffirmed those ties. What stands out is that again and again, it is mothers who are honored, not fathers. This reflects the crucial role maternal relatives often played in opening paths to advancement. Abbesses and abbots also ensured that their mothers were remembered. In one striking case, an abbot marked his mother's death in 2 lasting ways: by securing prayers for her soul and by donating a lavish piece of church furnishing that would remain visible for generations. Each time the community gathered, her memory would be present. These gestures show that mothers were not peripheral figures. They stood at the emotional and symbolic center of clerical family life. After mothers, siblings were the relatives most frequently remembered. Abbots recorded the deaths of sisters and brothers, especially when those siblings belonged to families long associated with the monastery. Gifts made by sisters were often especially visible, placed where both clergy and laypeople would see them. These offerings served not only devotional purposes, but also acted as enduring signs of family connection and prestige. Those who held the highest offices were able to extend this remembrance further. Bishops and abbots sometimes ensured that multiple relatives were included in communal prayer. In some cases, no donation accompanied the commemoration. The inclusion itself reflected affection, memory, and continued contact. Even when siblings did not live within religious communities, they remained part of the spiritual family. One abbot offers a particularly revealing example. His relatives appear repeatedly in local memorial records. His brother made gifts to the monastery and eventually joined it late in life. Female relatives were remembered at another religious house connected to the maternal side of the family. These patterns show how different branches of kinship aligned with different religious communities. The abbot himself likely encouraged these links, acting as a bridge between houses and family networks. What emerges from all of this is a clear picture. Even though abbots and bishops devoted their lives to religious service, family ties never lost their importance. In many cases, those ties had helped them reach their positions in the first place. Continued involvement with kin, remembrance of their deaths, and concern for their souls were not contradictions of religious life. They were an integral part of it. Members of the clergy shared with the wider aristocratic world a deep concern for the fate of loved ones after death. Their communities understood this and adapted their practices accordingly. The special emphasis placed on mothers is particularly revealing. Clerics lived in a world shaped by devotion to a maternal figure who stood between humanity and the divine. In that spiritual framework, it is not surprising that noble-born mothers occupied a similar role in the lives of their sons. They were guides, advocates, and mediators. Memory, affection, and belief combined to place them at the heart of clerical identity. It is not surprising that people in late antiquity and the Middle Ages were deeply drawn to the picture of the earliest Christian community presented at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. The image of believers gathering after Pentecost, sharing their lives, their faith, and their resources, offered a powerful vision of how a Christian community ought to function. What is far more striking, however, is how rarely this vision was directly invoked when rules and standards for religious life were being written. Precisely where we might expect to find clear references to these early chapters, silence often prevails. There are exceptions. Some early writers placed the Jerusalem community at the very heart of their reflections on communal religious life. But in many other foundational texts, references to Acts appear only briefly or are confined to narrow themes, most often questions surrounding personal property. This selective use contrasts sharply with one particular reform effort in the 8th century, where the image of the early church played a central and sustained role. This effort was led by a church leader who rose to prominence in the Frankish world during a period of intense political and religious transformation. Educated in elite circles and deeply involved in royal affairs, he later became responsible for shaping religious life in one of the most important cities of the region. His career placed him at the intersection of church reform, royal power, and the spiritual care of both clergy and laypeople. Alongside his political and pastoral responsibilities, he was also deeply committed to religious renewal, founding monasteries, reorganizing church communities, and guiding new foundations far beyond his own city. At a certain point during his leadership, he began to compose a rule for the clergy serving his cathedral. This text was not written all at once. Its first and largest portion is carefully structured and methodical. It lays out expectations for communal life, discipline, moral correction, and daily conduct. Throughout this section, language drawn from earlier monastic traditions appears frequently, yet the goal was never to turn cathedral clergy into monks. The intention was different. These men were allowed private dwellings and were not bound to the same routines as monastics. The guiding concern was not withdrawal from the world, but the creation of a unified and morally ordered community. From the very beginning, the author makes his priorities clear. Reforming the clergy was not an end in itself. It was a necessary step toward reforming society as a whole. The well-being of ordinary people weighed heavily on his mind, and he believed that a renewed clergy could lead the wider population toward a more righteous way of life. At the heart of this vision stood a single principle: unity, shared purpose, shared discipline, and shared values were presented as the defining marks of a holy community. Yet the most revealing part of this rule comes at the end. The final chapters differ sharply from everything that comes before. They are less orderly, more direct, and clearly shaped by practical experience. These chapters seem to respond to challenges that emerged only after the new way of life had already begun. Most importantly, they draw their inspiration not from earlier monastic traditions, but from the image of the earliest church found in Acts. Here, the Jerusalem community becomes more than an ideal. It becomes a model to be actively recreated. Each of the concluding chapters translates a feature of that early community into concrete practice. Shared resources, common life, collective worship, and care for the poor are no longer abstract ideals. They become instructions for daily living. The message is clear. A community that truly lives as one leaves no member behind. This focus reveals something essential about the Reformer's thinking. Like the author of Acts, he was not concerned only with leaders. His vision embraced the entire community. Clergy existed not for their own sake, but to sustain a way of life that allowed prayer, reflection, and charity to flourish among all believers. Leadership, in this view, was meant to create space for holiness rather than dominate it. To understand why the early church held such power in this vision, we must look more closely at how Acts presents that first community. In the opening chapters of the book, 3 short passages interrupt the fast-moving narrative. Each appears after moments of intense drama. These pauses allow the reader to step back and see the broader shape of communal life. They offer calm after upheaval, stability after conflict. In these moments, attention shifts away from individual figures and toward the shared life of the whole group. While the apostles remain central as teachers and preachers, the community as a whole becomes visible. Their labor allows others the time and security needed for prayer, reflection, and care for those in need. Action and contemplation are woven together, each supporting the other. Unity stands at the center of these descriptions. One of its most visible expressions is the way material goods are handled. Believers are described as living together, sharing what they have, and distributing resources according to need. Ownership does not disappear overnight, but it is transformed. Possessions are no longer held as private markers of status. They become tools for sustaining the community. Importantly, this sharing is portrayed as gradual and flexible. People continue to own property even after joining the community, and possessions are sold over time as needs arise. Houses and fields remain in private hands until they are needed for the common good. The community depends on these resources to support its leaders, care for widows, and meet daily needs. Despite a strong expectation that the end of the world was near, the early church did not ignore practical realities. Daily life still required food, shelter, and support. The message that emerges is not one of absolute poverty, but of responsible sharing. Faith and economic life are not opposed. They are brought into balance. This balance lies at the heart of the early Christian vision. The proclamation of faith and the way of life that faith demands cannot exist without attention to material realities. The church described in Acts is neither wealthy nor destitute. It is a living body that adapts, shares, and sustains itself so that its spiritual mission can endure. Even though the early Christian community did not require every newcomer to immediately sell everything they owned, it did demand something just as radical: a new way of thinking about possessions. The key idea is simple and unsettling. People might still be listed as owners on paper, yet within the community they no longer treated their goods as private territory. The decisive shift was not legal paperwork. It was the refusal to speak and act as if anything truly belonged to one person alone. What mattered most was attitude. Ownership became socially hollow because the community claimed a shared right over what individuals once held exclusively. This is the core of the message. Those famous summaries and acts do more than describe an ideal moment. They push readers toward a standard of behavior. In one crucial line, unity and property are placed side by side, and that pairing is not accidental. The text presents a practical path toward a unified community. If hearts are to become single and transparent, the barriers created by private possession must lose their power. In this picture, the greatest obstacle to shared purpose is not disagreement in words, but the quiet wall built by mine. Immediately after this ideal is stated, the narrative offers two human examples that make the point unforgettable. One man embodies openness and simplicity, willingly giving up valuable land and placing the proceeds at the community's disposal. Another couple embodies secrecy and manipulation, using property not to support the community, but to deceive it. The contrast is sharp on purpose. Wealth and possessions are not condemned simply because they exist, but because they tempt people into double lives, hidden motives, and divided hearts. The relationship between rich and poor, between owners and the needy, is treated as a constant problem requiring constant attention. Yet the goal is larger than personal virtue. The early community is portrayed as sharing a single inner life. It is not only that individuals become open and whole, the group itself behaves like one body with one purpose. The boundaries that separate people, harden them, and turn them into competitors are shown as broken down. In this vision, private possession is not merely an economic category. It is a symbol of division. The community's unity and its shared use of goods are spiritually tied together. One supports the other. This communal life is also linked to the work of the apostles. Teaching and proclamation do not stand apart from daily practice. They drive it. People are drawn in not only by what is preached, but by what is visibly lived. Shared prayer, shared support, and shared responsibility become a living proof of the message. The community's daily life becomes its testimony, and nowhere is this unity more visible than at the table. The early believers are shown gathering regularly to eat together, not in a remote ritual sense, but in the simple reality of shared meals. These meals carry joy and generosity. They build trust. They dissolve social distance. They also make unity tangible because everyone eats from the same life and the same supply. Through this repeated act, the community becomes real, not theoretical. When later reformers looked back to Acts, they sometimes read it with a sharper, more demanding lens. They did not emphasize gradual change or partial sharing. Instead, they presented the early Christians as people who all sold their land and placed the proceeds into communal hands. In this retelling, what is given up is not vague goods, but real property, estates, farms, and lots. The argument is not simply that believers shared. It is that they were the kind of people who would do this as a natural expression of their unity. Alongside this emphasis on shared resources came an equally strong emphasis on shared meals. Unity was described through repeated words that mean one, all, and together. Men, women, and even children appear at the scene, all receiving food in common. The picture is not primarily mystical or symbolic. It is practical and instructive. The meal becomes the workshop of community life. It is where bonds are forged and where care for the vulnerable is made visible. The scene ends not with theory, but with charity and gratitude. Enough food for everyone, and praise rising from the group. This is where the story becomes even more powerful. The shared meal is not only a sign of unity, it becomes the space where spiritual energy is felt and where community life is renewed. As they eat together, they are strengthened in faith and drawn into deeper devotion. Table becomes prayer. Prayer becomes solidarity, and solidarity makes the community's handling of goods and daily needs possible. When this model is carried into later reform programs, the shared table becomes one of the main tools for shaping human behavior. Eating alone is discouraged. Meals are meant to be taken together. The dining hall is treated as a stage where community order is reinforced every day. Seating arrangements reflect internal structure, yet the greater message remains. The community is meant to eat as one, to gather as one, and to become one. Feasts and commemorations are also shaped around communal dining. Meals mark celebration, loyalty, alliance, and shared memory. In the wider medieval world, shared eating often sealed agreements and strengthened bonds. In the cathedral community, the same logic applies. Eating together becomes a social glue. It creates cohesion. It builds the harmony that reformers wanted, and the reverse is equally revealing. Those who break the community's rules are separated from the common table. The punishment is not only about food, it is about exclusion from belonging. Being made to eat apart underlines a basic truth of this system. Common dining is not a minor detail. It is one of the strongest symbols of unity and one of the most effective ways to train a group to live as a single body. Sharing a meal is one of the strongest ways a group can express who it is. When people sit at the same table, they do more than eat. They signal belonging. They create bonds. They turn individuals into a community. By insisting that the canons eat and celebrate together, Crotagang used the shared table as a tool to shape a new collective identity and to present a living image of what the Church ought to be. Although his rule was written for the cathedral clergy, its vision often stretches beyond those limits. At certain times, local clergy from the city and countryside were welcomed into the canon's dining hall, especially on Sundays and major feast days. On other occasions, monks joined the canons for celebrations tied to local traditions and diocesan festivals. In this way, all branches of religious life in Metz were drawn into a single rhythm. Cathedral clergy, parish clergy, and monks did not live as isolated groups, but met repeatedly around the table, where shared food reinforced shared purpose. Throughout his rule, Crotagang showed a willingness to soften or even abandon strict ascetic ideals that were popular in monastic circles of his time. Yet one practice remained non-negotiable. The common table appears again and again, far more frequently than almost any other inherited monastic custom. For Crotagang, as for many people of the early medieval world, eating together was the most effective way to turn strangers into brothers. It was both symbol and substance. It represented unity, and it produced it. In the early Christian narrative that Crotagang looked back to, he found exactly the model he needed. Even though his understanding of that story differed in places from its earliest form, he read the shared meal as the heart of the first Christian community. Because of this, he later returned to that story and used it to justify his own reforms. What began as practical regulation was eventually given a deeper scriptural foundation. This becomes clear in the chapter of his rule that deals with the property of the canons. After recalling the condition of the early believers, Chrodegang encourages his clergy to imitate that way of life, even if only in a limited sense. He then lays out practical paths by which this imitation could take place. One option was direct and traditional. Those who felt called to a higher level of devotion could give up everything they owned. In return, the bishop would provide what they needed to live and to carry out good works. This approach followed well-established religious practice and was already familiar from monastic life. Yet it is striking that this solution receives only brief attention, tucked into the closing lines of a very long chapter. Its placement suggests that Chrodegang did not expect many to choose this path, nor did he see it as the most important one. The second option marked a clear departure from earlier tradition. For those unable or unwilling to abandon all possessions, Chrodegang proposed a different relationship with property. Instead of renouncing everything, these canons were to place their estates under the control of the church they served. The church would hold legal ownership, while the canon would continue to draw support from the land in the form of regular income. In this arrangement, land no longer functioned as a personal asset, but as a shared resource that sustained both the clergy and the poor. Personal belongings remained largely under individual control, allowing the canon to give alms freely and to meet daily needs. At death, however, the land passed fully into communal hands, while movable goods were divided between charitable use and support for the clergy. Through this system, property was transformed from a private marker of status into an instrument of service. This practical arrangement reveals how deeply Chrodegang had absorbed the message of the early Christian story. His goal was not simply to retell it, but to make it workable in his own time. He understood that the earliest believers were not defined by legal formulas, but by attitude. Ownership existed, but exclusive control did not. The community mattered more than the individual claim. By offering more than one path into communal life, Chrodegang reflected the flexibility of the earliest church. Some believers gave up everything. Others remained owners in name, while surrendering control in practice. What mattered was not uniformity of sacrifice, but unity of intention. In this way, Chrodegang reshaped ancient ideals into a system that addressed real economic and social conditions. His reforms did not demand perfection from all, but they demanded transformation. Property was no longer something to defend, but something to place at the service of others. The shared table, sustained by shared resources, became the visible heart of this new way of life. This system, as it is presented, was meant to spark a living imitation of the way of life associated with the apostles. It allowed members of the community to hold everything in common while still making it possible for them to benefit from material resources without moral fault. In this arrangement, goods were enjoyed, but no longer treated as private possessions. Although income continued to flow from land, the right to sell, damage, or dispose of that land was removed. Wealth remained present, yet it no longer functioned as personal property in the usual sense. What was achieved here was exactly what the early Christian story describes, a transformation not of economics alone, but of attitude. Control existed, but ownership did not fully belong to the individual. Property could no longer be claimed as something purely one's own. Instead, it was placed within a shared framework, where use replaced possession. This approach carefully separated two ideas that are often confused: the act of selling property and the deeper surrender of exclusive claims over it. One could remain connected to land without asserting personal ownership, just as the earliest believers did. In this structure, real property was transferred to the church itself, which held formal authority over it. Those who had once been owners became beneficiaries rather than masters. Even though resources were not placed in the hands of apostles, as in the ancient narrative, they were entrusted to a church closely associated with the memory of apostolic life. The gesture carried the same meaning, adapted to a new setting. Underlying this system was a conviction inherited from the earliest Christian tradition. Material wealth is not evil in itself, but it can obstruct genuine commitment. The way people relate to possessions reveals how they respond to the call of God. Goods are not neutral. They shape belief, loyalty, and intention. In this sense, wealth becomes a test of discipleship. This understanding shaped every aspect of the arrangements described here. Equally central was a vision of community. The earliest Christians were not defined simply by shared belief, but by shared life. Their unity was not abstract. It was visible in how they prayed, ate, and managed resources together. The spiritual bond that united them expressed itself in concrete practices, especially in the way they treated property. Shared faith naturally led to shared goods. One followed the other. This connection between inner unity and external sharing lay at the heart of the system being proposed. The language used throughout these regulations reflects this emphasis. It speaks collectively, urging all members forward together, not as subjects under command, but as participants in a common calling. The goal was not obedience alone, but transformation. To reinforce this, members were required not only to transfer control of their land to the church, but also to name that community as their heir. In life and in death, their material legacy was directed inward, toward the group to which they belonged. Just as families inherited property in secular society, so here the religious community replaced blood ties as the primary recipient of loyalty and resources. This shift reflects a broader Christian idea. Discipleship replaces family as the strongest bond. The community becomes the new household. Older ties are not denied, but they are reordered. Commitment to the shared life takes precedence over connections outside it. This vision of reform drew deeply from an interpretation of early Christian life as a timeless model. Scripture was not treated as distant history, but as a guide meant to shape the present. Yet this model had to be translated. Ideals were adapted to fit contemporary realities. What emerged was not a literal copy of the past, but a structured attempt to recreate its spirit in a new age. This way of thinking did not stop with one generation. It opened paths that later thinkers and leaders would explore more fully. The belief that Christian society could be shaped into a holy people, guided by shared discipline, shared belief, and shared practice, would become a defining feature of later reform movements. Looking backward, it becomes clear that debates of earlier centuries continued to shape later thought. Questions first raised in the Carolingian world did not disappear. They re-emerged in new forms, especially in discussions surrounding the central rite of Christian worship. Disagreements about how divine presence should be understood did not belong to one age alone. They formed a continuous thread stretching across centuries. Early theological disputes laid foundations that later generations would inherit. Arguments over how spiritual realities were present in sacred rituals forced thinkers to refine language, sharpen distinctions, and confront the relationship between symbol and reality. These discussions were not abstract exercises. They were responses to practical concerns: how belief was taught, how unity was preserved, and how faith was made intelligible to new communities. One influential voice in these early debates sought to clarify how sacred elements could truly convey divine presence. Drawing from respected authorities of earlier centuries, he offered a vision meant to educate and unify, especially among newly converted peoples. His work was shaped by missionary needs as much as by intellectual inquiry. Faith had to be explained in ways that could be understood, lived, and trusted. As these ideas spread, they provoked responses, refinements, and disagreements. What began as a localized discussion gradually widened into a broader conversation involving many leading thinkers. Over time, earlier positions gained dominance, while alternative views continued to resurface, challenging accepted interpretations and sparking renewed controversy. By the early 11th century, these unresolved questions returned with force. Preachers and writers revisited them, addressing audiences who were living in a world shaped by both inherited tradition and new spiritual anxieties. In doing so, they revealed how deeply earlier debates still influenced Christian thought. At the center of the debate for Paschasius, and for many thinkers of his age, stood a single, deeply challenging question: how Christ was present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. By the 9th century, most churchmen agreed that Christ was truly present in the sacrament. What divided them was not whether this presence existed, but what kind of presence it was. For Paschasius, the answer was uncompromising. He argued that once the priest consecrated the bread and wine, they became the actual flesh and blood of Christ. Outwardly, nothing appeared to change. The bread still looked like bread, the wine still tasted like wine. Yet inwardly, through divine power, their substance was transformed. What believers consumed was not a symbol, but Christ himself, made present in a hidden yet real way. From the opening of his work on the Eucharist, Paschasius insisted on this point. The host, he claimed, was the true body and the true blood of Christ. Even though the physical form remained unchanged, the reality beneath that form was entirely altered. The faithful, he explained, ate Christ's flesh and drank his blood, not with the senses but through faith. Again and again, he returned to this idea, stressing that the bread was nothing less than Christ's body and the wine nothing less than his blood, given from heaven for the salvation of humanity. More striking still was Paschasius's insistence that the body present in the Eucharist was not a spiritual abstraction, but the historical body of Christ. According to his teaching, the flesh received at the altar was the same flesh born of Mary, the same body that hung on the cross, was laid in the tomb, and rose again. The blood in the chalice was the very blood shed during the Passion. For Paschasius, there could be no separation between the Christ of history and the Christ of the sacrament. He grounded this claim firmly in Scripture. Drawing especially from the Gospel of John, he pointed to Christ's declaration that the Word became flesh, and that this flesh was offered as true food. Christ's own words, declaring his flesh to be real nourishment and his blood real drink, were taken at face value. If Christ was truth itself, Paschasius argued, then his words could not deceive. What Christ promised at the Last Supper must therefore be fulfilled whenever the sacrament is celebrated. This conviction extended to the role of the priest. Because Christ's words were fully effective, Paschasius maintained that when a priest spoke them in the rite, the transformation truly occurred. The power did not belong to the priest as an individual, but to the divine promise embedded in Christ's words. Through them, the mystery was renewed again and again. To reinforce this understanding, Paschasius turned not only to Scripture, but also to accounts of miracles associated with the Eucharist. For him, the sacrament itself was already a miracle, since it reversed the ordinary laws of nature. But he also narrated stories meant to make this invisible reality visible. In these stories, the host appeared as an infant, or as Christ himself, or as living flesh and blood revealed during the breaking of the bread. Such accounts were meant to instruct and strengthen faith, helping believers grasp the sacrifice made present on the altar. These stories emphasized a key point. Although the outward appearance of bread and wine remained unchanged, the inner reality had been transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. Paschasius compared this transformation to other divine acts, such as rebirth through baptism or the incarnation itself. In each case, invisible grace worked through visible matter. The faithful, he insisted, could discern this reality not with their senses, but with belief. The miracle narratives also served another purpose. They reinforced the idea that the Eucharist was a true sacrifice. Paschasius carefully distinguished this sacrifice from the Passion itself. Christ suffered and died only once, conquering death in a single historical act. Yet the sacrifice of the altar, though mystical, was real. What was offered daily was not a new death, but the same saving sacrifice made present again for the forgiveness of sins. Because human beings continued to sin daily, Paschasius argued, there must also be a daily offering. The Eucharist fulfilled this need. Through it, the power of Christ's sacrifice continued to cleanse and redeem. Christ did not die again on the altar, but he was truly offered there in a mysterious and sacramental way. Only if the Eucharist contained the real body of Christ could it bring true redemption. This understanding also shaped Paschasius's views on communion. Receiving the Eucharist was not merely an act of remembrance, it was a means of union. By eating Christ's flesh and drinking his blood, believers became one with him. And because Christ was one with the Father, this union extended upward, drawing the faithful into divine life itself. At the same time, communion strengthened bonds on earth. Sharing the Eucharist united believers with one another, forming a single body. The sacrament was therefore both vertical and horizontal. It joined humanity to God and bound Christians together into a living community. For Paschasius, all of this led to a single conclusion. The Eucharist had to be the real, historical body and blood of Christ. Only such a presence could unite believers with Christ, sustain the Church, wash away sin, and offer salvation. Anything less would strip the sacrament of its power and break the bond between Christ, his sacrifice, and his people. The debate over the Eucharist did not fade with the 9th century. By the early 11th century, questions about right belief and right practice were still very much alive, and few figures show this more clearly than Adhemar of Chabannes, a monk active in the religious centers of Aquitaine. He was not only a writer and copyist with an enormous output, but also a controversial promoter of a local saint's status, an effort that ultimately collapsed. That defeat mattered because it placed his own credibility under scrutiny and pushed him to speak more forcefully about what true faith meant. In the years after this public setback, Adhemar produced sermons that reveal the anxieties and priorities of an Orthodox monk living in a region where rumors of false teaching spread easily. He describes the Christian world as threatened from within by people who rejected foundational practices of the Church. In his warnings, these opponents do not merely disagree on minor points. They deny baptism, deny the Mass, deny the cross, and deny the Church itself. For Adhemar, this is not an abstract danger. It is framed as a spiritual emergency, a sign that deception is working quietly among believers. To make his point vivid, he repeats stories about heretics using a mysterious powder mixed into food or drink, a substance that supposedly dulled the mind and cut people off from truth. Whether or not such a practice ever existed is beside the point in his narrative. The story functions like a dark mirror of communion, a deliberate imitation that corrupts what the Church offers for life. That contrast helps explain why Adhemar returns to the Eucharist again and again. If rivals mocked or rejected the sacrament, then defending it became a way of defending the entire structure of Christian belief. Before turning fully to the Eucharist, Adhemar's wider intellectual world needs to be understood. His writings show a deep respect for earlier authorities, especially those linked to the Carolingian age. Great rulers and past reformers occupy a major place in his historical imagination, and the works he copied reveal what texts were still treated as weighty and trustworthy in his day. He filled manuscripts with older voices, and at times even tried to shelter his own arguments behind respected names. This matters because it shows how Adhemar sought legitimacy. The safest ground was the ground already consecrated by tradition. When Adhemar explains the Eucharist, his position is unmistakable. He teaches that the bread and wine are changed into the body and blood of Christ. Before consecration, they are ordinary elements. After the priest speaks the sacred words, Adhemar insists that they are no longer what they were. Their outward form remains, but their inner reality is different. In sermon after sermon, he drives home the same claim: what is received at the altar is truly Christ. And he does not mean this in a vague or purely symbolic way. For Adhemar, the presence is concrete and historical. The body given in the Eucharist is the same body born of Mary, the same body that suffered on the cross, rose again, and ascended. The sacrament, in his telling, is tied directly to the earthly life of Jesus. The Mass becomes a living bridge between the past event and the present worship, not as memory alone, but as real participation in what Christ did. To defend this, Adhemar anchors his teaching in Scripture. He draws on older patterns of sacrifice from the Hebrew Scriptures, describing them as shadows that point forward to Christ. Abel's offering, Abraham's obedience, Melchizedek's bread and wine. These are treated as signs that anticipate the true sacrifice. But the strongest support comes from the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Adhemar repeatedly returns to the passage where Christ declares that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink, and he uses it as a dividing line. Those who reject this teaching are placed in the same category as earlier opponents who could not accept the claim that Christ is the bread from heaven. Adhemar also uses miracle stories to make the invisible visible. His accounts are more graphic and dramatic than earlier examples. In some visions, the host appears as a wounded infant in the priest's hands. In others, a child is seen on the altar where bread and wine should be. Elsewhere, worshippers see angels circling above the altar, or a lamb shedding blood into the chalice. The purpose of these scenes is not entertainment. They are meant to persuade the listener that what appears ordinary is, in reality, the living Christ. These stories feed into another theme that dominates Adhemar's preaching: sacrifice. He emphasizes that Christ suffered and died once in history, yet he also speaks of a daily offering on the altar. The language is intense. The Mass is described as the Lord's sacrifice made present in ritual action. In a striking chain of images, Adhemar connects the priest's actions to key moments of Christ's story. The breaking of bread becomes linked to sacrifice. The placing of bread into the chalice becomes linked to resurrection, and the sharing of communion becomes linked to ascent and heavenly life. Whether one agrees with the imagery or not, the goal is clear. Adhemar wants his listeners to grasp the Mass as the central act of Christian worship, not a bare ceremony. For Adhemar, this is not only a doctrine to be defended, but a lifeline. He speaks of the Eucharist as necessary for salvation, a gift that brings remission of sins and true life. Communion is described as the daily bread Christians ask for in the Lord's Prayer, and the sacrament is presented as the means through which divine grace reaches the human soul. Without it, he says, there is no true life and no forgiveness. The Eucharist becomes the boundary between darkness and light, error and truth. Across these sermons, the echoes of Paschasius are hard to miss. The phrasing is not identical, and Adhemar's style often leans into sharper, more vivid images. Yet the core beliefs align. The real presence, the historical reality of Christ's body and blood, the grounding in Scripture, the use of miracles as confirmation, the understanding of the Mass as sacrifice, and the conviction that communion is essential for salvation. Taken together, these themes suggest that early 11th century churchmen were not inventing a new framework from scratch. They were extending, intensifying, and reapplying ideas inherited from earlier centuries, adapting them to new fears, new opponents, and new battles over what counted as true faith. On the 19th of March, 1317, Jacques Fournier was appointed Bishop of Pamiers, a new diocese in the rugged country south of Toulouse, carved out of valleys and mountain villages that belonged to the world of foi. He was 37 years old. He had grown up in the region, later trained in Paris, and built his career through monastic institutions, rising to leadership by 1311. When he arrived in Pamiers, he did not inherit a quiet frontier. He inherited unfinished work. Unlike earlier bishops who had been pulled into local power struggles, Fournier moved like a planner. He traveled through his territory methodically, village by village, and he recorded what he saw with extraordinary care. Those notes later allowed historians to rebuild the social texture of the Eastern Pyrenees in rare detail. Yet the documents reveal more than traces of Cathar survival. They show hostility toward the Church, casual contempt for its authority, and an alarming level of confusion about the most basic teachings. The deeper question was not simply who believed wrongly, but who had been guiding the parishes at all. It may seem surprising that even in the early 14th century, a region in southern Europe could still lack effective religious oversight. After decades of conquest, after the growing reach of the papacy, after the spread of new orders and preaching movements, one might expect tighter control and clearer instruction. Fournier discovered the opposite. The area had experienced a late revival of Cathar influence in the generation before him, fueled by a small group of wandering preachers and sustained by an atmosphere in which local rulers had often looked the other way. The Albigensian Crusades were supposed to have ended the movement. In these mountains, the story was messier. By the time Fournier arrived, the remaining believers were mostly older peasants, clinging to habits and loyalties that were fading with their generation. It was not a triumphant underground church. It was a remnant. And yet the larger problem Fournier uncovered went beyond remnants of Catharism. He found a broad, untidy landscape of unapproved opinions and practical unbelief, mixed with resentment and ignorance. His first shock came in the summer of 1318, when a parish priest reported that a woman named Aude had begun to doubt the real presence of Christ in the host. Fournier moved quickly and investigated with care, working through the local clergy rather than treating it as a rumor to be ignored. Aude's story exposed how uneven practice could be from one village to the next. She had come to Merville as a teenager after marriage and said she had never received communion in her home parish because it simply was not customary for young people there. In Merville, she confessed at Easter but refused communion, and her husband reacted with anger, insisting that everyone in his village received once a year. The next Easter she complied, but afterwards a knot tightened in her mind. She believed she had withheld a grave sin in confession, and yet she had still been allowed to receive. For an educated theologian, the reasoning is confused. For an anxious, untrained conscience, it could feel like proof that something in the ceremony was not real, or not safe, or not true. Over the following years, her distress deepened. In 1318, she fell seriously ill and experienced a full crisis of faith. She begged those around her to pray and to teach her how to pray correctly. In fever and fear, she confessed everything to her husband, who sent her to the priest, and the priest went to the bishop. Fournier did not respond with brutality. He pardoned her and imposed a program meant to rebuild discipline and belief. Regular confessions each year, yearly meetings for several years, fasting on certain days unless illness or feast days intervened, and a set of local pilgrimages. The episode shows Fournier acting as a careful pastor, treating a frightened woman as someone to be restored rather than crushed. But only months later, another case revealed a different problem, one rooted not in fear and ignorance, but in open contempt. Pierre Sabatier, a weaver from Varilhes, was denounced by a relative for attacking the church. At first he tried to minimize it, claiming he had spoken while drunk. Under repeated questioning across many months, a harsher pattern emerged. For about 2 years, he had publicly said that much of what was sung and spoken in church was fabricated by clergy to collect offerings, making an exception only for the creed and the words of consecration. Here too, Fournier chose instruction over execution. He taught Pierre the essentials of the sacraments and belief, then sentenced him to wear a visible mark of condemnation that carried severe social stigma, a punishment later reduced after a year. Both cases carried the same striking detail. When asked who had taught them these errors, each insisted that no one had. They claimed the ideas were their own conclusions. The claim was repeated so often in Fournier's records that it forms a pattern. It suggests a world where doubtful opinions circulated widely, yet people preferred to present them as personal discoveries, born from observation, frustration, or experience, rather than from organized teachers. At first, Fournier's responses were relatively restrained. Over time, restraint became harder to maintain. With each inquiry, the bishop seemed to lift the roof from another household and find more of the same spiritual disarray. By the spring of 1320, executions had begun, and the shocks continued. He encountered Waldensians, accusations of sorcery, and even signs of Cathar belief among members of the clergy. The crisis was not confined to peasants. The aftermath of executions produced its own dangerous stories. People whispered that condemned Waldensians went to the flames calmly, praying even as the ropes burned away. One man spread the tale from tavern to tavern, arguing that such composure proved they were not heretics because God had received them. He ended up imprisoned for years. Another was condemned for saying that the bishop would never have burned the accused if he had truly listened. These reactions show how fragile authority could be in the face of public violence, and how quickly sympathy could turn into open defiance. There were even rumors that Fournier wept at an execution. If he did, the reasons could have been many. It might have been grief over souls he believed lost. It might have been the weight of an office that demanded lethal decisions. Or it might have been something darker. The realization that those he condemned often died, convinced they represented the true church, while Catholicism, in their eyes, was hypocrisy and lies. In Pamiers, Fournier was not only fighting organized heresy, he was confronting a deeper collapse of trust, knowledge, and religious coherence in a remote society that had learned to question the very people appointed to guide it. What emerges from these stories is not a handful of isolated doubts, but a broad climate of skepticism. Across the region, many people felt a growing distance between what the church claimed and what daily life seemed to confirm. Forgiveness, spiritual authority, and punishment were increasingly seen as human inventions rather than divine truths. For many, absolution belonged to God alone, and the promises made by priests were viewed as empty words. This distrust extended to the threat of exclusion from the community. Many believed it had nothing to do with God, and everything to do with control. God, they argued, never expelled anyone, nor had he granted such power to men. These opinions were not hidden. They were spoken openly, even directly to clergy. People pointed out that they had built their churches themselves, paid for them themselves, and asked why anyone else should have the right to bar them from a place that was theirs. Some voices went even further. To them, the soul was not something mysterious or eternal, but something physical, blood or breath. Stories of miracles, divine birth, resurrection, and ascension were dismissed as impossible. Heaven was defined as happiness in this life, hell as suffering in it. Moral instruction, charity, and proper conduct were treated not as sacred duties, but as meaningless talk, even ridicule. Such doubts appeared even during religious festivals. Offers to pray for the dead were sometimes refused outright, dismissed as useless. Religious services were questioned in the same way. Many wondered what difference these rituals truly made. Belief was shaped not only by words, but by experience. Blood seen at the moment of death, the final breath leaving the body. These observations became proof for some of what the soul really was. Teachings about sacred bread were often mocked. If a divine presence truly existed there, people joked, it would surely have been consumed long ago. Comparisons with other religions were common, and many openly acknowledged how strange their own beliefs might appear from the outside. These arguments usually took place among friends and neighbors, on bridges, in fields, or outside homes. Strong words were exchanged, but no one considered them dangerous. Such conversations could continue for years, without consequence. Only much later, when official investigations began, were people forced to reflect on words spoken long ago. When questioned, many offered the same explanation. No one had ever properly instructed them. They attended services, but did not listen. Their thoughts were on work, survival, and daily concerns. Religious teaching felt distant from real life. Their ideas were not learned from others, but formed through personal reflection and common sayings, heard again and again. Above all, they did not believe these thoughts were sinful. Even when punishments were imposed, enforcement was often weak. Sentences existed in theory, but in practice they were applied only when authority was visibly present. Once supervision faded, life returned to normal. Resentment toward the clergy continued to grow. Many believed priests were more interested in land, taxes, and power than in guiding souls. Some wished they would all be sent away, leaving only a few to perform basic religious duties. These were not careful statements, but expressions of deep frustration. The problem was not limited to the people. Some clergy themselves were uncertain about what they taught. There were priests who misunderstood core beliefs, who spoke hesitantly, who preached ideas that confused rather than clarified. Their congregations rarely challenged them, perhaps because doubt had already taken root, or because few were truly listening. What stands out in this story is the severity of the response. The man at the center of it recognized his mistake, sought advice, corrected his view within days, returned to his community to explain himself, and then came forward of his own accord to admit what had happened and ask for forgiveness. Yet the punishment was crushing. He was confined for a full year, and for 2 more years he was forced into a harsh routine of deprivation. By the time he was judged, years of dealing with stubborn offenders had clearly hardened the authorities. After a long stretch of constant defiance and scandal, patience had worn thin. It is easy to imagine that the same case, brought forward earlier, might have ended with a gentler outcome. Not long after, a new assistant stepped into a church role once held by a man who had been removed. On paper, the replacement looked impressive. He could argue confidently, defend himself in formal debate, and openly admitted that he read certain passages differently than other clerics. The problem was not his intelligence, but his certainty. He shared his private conclusions with ordinary people and pushed them far beyond accepted teaching. He spoke as if the universe were ruled by 2 opposing powers, and he denied that human beings truly choose their actions. When pressed about where these ideas came from, he claimed they came from his own reading and from sayings commonly repeated in the region, along with stories circulating among the people. He insisted no outside group had trained him. Even so, he received a punishment that outstripped many sentences given to open supporters of forbidden movements. That difference signals a tightening mood, a new determination to discipline not only lay people, but also the clergy themselves. And these are only the cases we can see. For every scandal recorded, countless others must have passed without notice. Taken together, the situation becomes easier to understand. Most priests were likely not monsters, and many probably tried to do their duty. Still, even decent men could be poorly trained, easily confused, or stretched thin. Similar problems existed elsewhere in France, so this was not an isolated pocket of corruption. Yet the density of complaints in this region remained striking. We have to ask whether the surviving records exaggerate the crisis, or whether the area truly had deeper conditions that made religious conflict and resentment more likely. Part of the answer lies in geography and hardship. Remote communities, limited education, and widespread poverty created a world where instruction was thin and misunderstanding was common. Seen from the great centers of power, this territory sat at the edges, only slowly being absorbed into the dominant culture. Reform efforts did arrive, but they often came with blunt force. The more the church relied on threats and exclusion to break local influence and extract higher payments from peasants, the more it convinced people that faith had been taken from them and turned into a tool of officials. These tactics deepened anger without solving the real problem, the enormous distance between the high-ranking leaders and the everyday world of rural priests and villagers. Many local clerics came from the same background as the people they served. They shared the same assumptions, the same habits of speech, the same limits of learning. Meanwhile, the educated elites who managed major institutions lived in a different mental universe. When a new church administration was created to close this gap, it failed for a long time because the leaders placed over it often lacked the will or skill to carry out meaningful improvement. To understand why oversight failed, we have to look at how the local administration was created in the first place. It was not born primarily from pastoral concern. It rose from power struggles over land, rights, and revenue. Political alliances shifted. Contracts were rewritten. Rival authorities fought over who controlled towns, fortresses, and incomes. A new bishopric was established in the middle of this conflict, and its first leader was chosen not because he was a great reformer, but because he was useful in a larger battle. Predictably, spiritual renewal did not become the priority. The harsh work of discipline fell instead to external enforcement, while local leadership focused on lawsuits, control, and income. The pattern continued under later leaders. Some were scarcely present in the role in any meaningful way. Some were tangled in worldly disputes. Some enforced severe judgments when it served their goals, yet spent more energy squeezing revenue than improving instruction. In that light, the arrival of a more serious reforming figure becomes easier to measure. Before him, very little had been done by anyone with direct authority to raise the quality of religious teaching in the mountains. We can also see why hostility grew so intense. The drive to increase tithes and enforce collection became relentless. In at least one village, an entire community was swept up and arrested for failing to pay at a higher rate. People themselves drew the connection between cause and effect. They said plainly that clerics demanded more because no strong lord remained to restrain them. They spoke of blocking priests from passing through the mountain routes if the old order still stood. When challenged, they sometimes clarified that their anger was not directed at every priest, but at those whose greed and bad example harmed the community. At the same time, popular religion in the region could take surprising forms. Stories spread of the dead appearing to the living, asking for help, requesting prayers, speaking of the afterlife with confidence and warmth. Messages circulated that promised mercy on an enormous scale, insisting that damnation was not the final destiny of anyone who sought forgiveness. When questioned about where such beliefs came from, the answer was simple. People had heard preachers speak this way, and the idea felt true because divine mercy seemed limitless. Authorities responded by correcting doctrine directly, laying out what should be believed about judgment, punishment, and the fate of souls. Yet the exchanges show how easily ordinary people blended official teaching, rumor, folk sayings, and personal experience into a single worldview. No single cause explains why resentment and unorthodox ideas were so common here. Many people thought of themselves as good Catholics while holding beliefs that were far from standard teaching. Others admired forbidden preachers, yet still participated in parish life. In these villages, debate was normal. Everyone knew everyone else's business, yet most people tolerated eccentric opinions. The atmosphere was permissive in the sense that conversation flowed freely. Arguments could last for years, and daily life continued anyway. Without a strong, consistent system of instruction, belief was shaped informally through family, friends, local figures, wandering voices, and sometimes poorly prepared clergy. Those who should have guided the population often had other priorities or simply looked away. Eventually, the reforming bishop was moved to a different post. Given the politics of the time, we cannot help wondering if diligence itself became inconvenient. Soon he rose again, reaching the highest office in the church through a chain of decisions shaped as much by strategy and revenue as by spiritual need. New dioceses were created rapidly, officially to improve care, but the deeper motive was to rearrange power and secure future elections. The result was an extraordinary irony. A man known for relentless seriousness rose because of political calculation. Even at the summit, the same temperament remained. He pushed for campaigns abroad, fought internal opponents, and issued rulings meant to settle major debates. Yet the largest goals proved harder than discipline in a mountain diocese. Peace among rulers did not hold. The return to Rome did not happen. Internal divisions did not fully heal. A great war between kingdoms could not be prevented. The story ends with a final human question hanging in the air. After all the effort, all the certainty, all the punishment and reform, did any of these failures ever trouble him deeply, or did duty always come first?